Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Ghost in the Machine in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 56, Eerie Birth of a Wish, Part 2. Alphys sat up, her brain still throbbing inside her skull. Gabrietta sat at her side and monitored her condition as best she could, her long, angular skull-like face emerging from the dim shadows, a pale green glow wreathing her bony hands. Wondering where she was but unable to communicate clearly with Gabrietta, Alphys examined her surroundings. She could barely see a thing without her glasses unless she squinted, then she could see a little bit. One thing she could see at least a little clearly, though, was the picture frame on the bedside table. A tall monster woman with a sharp, angular obsidian face standing behind two children. One, a scaly blue girl with fiery hair, a square white bandage over her left eye and a toothy grin on her face, and the other, a shorter snake girl with iridescent blue-green scales who seemed a little irritated at having the obsidian woman's stony hand on her shoulder. Alphys knew one of the girls in the photograph at first glance. It was Undyne. And the second girl. This was Lieutenant Snaka's house. Her bed. So Snaka hadn't just failed to kill her, Alphys realized she had decided to spare her. That couldn't have gone over well with Chara. Alphys clutched at her aching forehead. You. Undyne, she gasped. It was still hard to get words out. She could think them easily enough, that wasn't hard, but just as she couldn't read them or write them anymore, even speaking them had become a challenge. The words didn't want to come out in the right order, or sometimes even at all. Gabrietta's foggy emerald eyes were dispassionate as she continued to examine Alphys, prodding gently at the wood marring her neck. Undyne, have to, phone. Phone. Alphys raised her hand and tapped on the side of her head with her claw. Okay. Gotta, no. If she's. Gabrietta shook her head. No, that wasn't good enough. She had to make sure Undyne was okay. If Chara had tried to eliminate her, they'd surely have tried to take Undyne out as well. Please. Let me call. Gabrietta pulled out a notepad, scribbled a drawing on it, and held it in front of Alphys' snout. It was a crudely drawn cell phone with an X through it. We don't have phone. Gabrietta shook her head. She doesn't have one. Gabrietta nodded. Help. Help her. Alphys tried to pull herself out of bed, throwing off the rough sheets. Damn, Snaka lived like this? She was practically a monk if her home was any indication. Gabrietta held her down, shaking her head. Damn it. Let go. Alphys struggled with her and broke free, pulling herself over to what looked like a desk and what looked like a personal computer on top of the desk. The revisor system. A centralized server linking the visors she'd reverse-engineered from 2B's and 9S's equipment. If Undyne was connected, Alphys could hack in through the backdoor she'd created and send her a message. Or she could connect to her private server and send a message to Pod 042 and 153 and ask them for help. Alphys reached the computer in spite of Gabrietta's silent protests, powered it on, and pulled up a terminal, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, ready to work her wizardry. And then she realized. The characters on the keyboard all looked like alien squiggles to her now, numbers, letters, punctuation, all meaningless nonsense. She backed away from the computer, hands falling limply to her sides, bowing her head and chewing on her lip as hot tears began to well up and roll down her cheeks. There was nothing she could do. Absolutely nothing. Undyne meant the world to her and she could have been hurt or even dead, and there was nothing Alphys could do. She fell to her knees and wailed as Gabrietta caught up to her, hot tears burning her eyes like acid as they rolled down her snout and dripped onto the floor. The surgeon knelt beside her, still managing to tower over her, and laid her hands on Alphys' shoulders, running her cold fingertips softly and tenderly across her scales. For a skeletal monster, Gabrietta's embrace was just as inviting as Undyne's had always been, though Undyne had always been much more enthusiastic and had a much stronger grip. Gabrietta doodled something on the notepad and held it out for Alphys. It was a crude drawing of herself, a crude drawing of Alphys, and a little pentagon-shaped thing that Alphys supposed was a shield. Alphys squeezed her eyes shut, choking down sobs as they threatened to tear themselves from her throat. I don't know Undyne, am my girlfriend, I don't know what happened to her, If she's dead or, every word fought against her as she tried to force it out, each one struggling to tear itself from her memory before she could use it. I need help. Help her. I need to help her. I need help. Gabrietta tapped her on the shoulder, catching Alfie's attention, and pointed to the computer. Can't you use it? Alfie insisted. Gabrietta glanced at the computer, then pointed at herself. Alfie shook her head, growing even more frustrated. She felt like a prisoner in her own head. And no. Can't use it, she repeated. No, reading. No WR writing. And no T typing. Gabrietta wiggled her fingers, then pointed at herself again. She wanted to hack into Alfie's server? With what computer skills? Alfie nearly laughed. No, and no. No. Why you? Don't know how to, how to. Gabrietta tapped on Alfie's forehead next, then her own, then pointed again to the computer. And no. And then it struck her. Of course. Even if a painter lost their arms, they still knew how to paint. Alfie gathered her thoughts. Run C command prompt, she told the doctor. And next. Little by little, she began to feed Gabrietta instructions, and little by little, they began to make progress. Stark and shifting lights and shadows bathed the streets as 2B and Undyne crossed blades. With every parry, every riposte, sparks flew through the air in whirls and eddies, borne by the wild currents of air flowing around the two fighters as they danced their deadly ballet. Undyne fought like a demon, wild and enraged. Every swing of her blade, every thrust of her spear was meant to be a finishing move, and every one of them brought with it a whirlwind of lightning carried through the scorched air. 2B, by contrast, moved with quiet, measured, purposeful grace, swift both to attack and to retreat. However, even with her more conservative fighting style, and even with 3 swords the virtuous contract in her right hand, the Joyeuse in her left, and Alfie's switchblade mounted on her right forearm, 2B found it difficult to both fend off Undyne's attacks and penetrate her offensive shield. Undyne, after all, had nigh infinite weapons at her disposal. And despite her intent to stand and fight, 2B quickly found herself on the back foot. 2B staggered under the force of Undyne's next attack, reeling as the electrical discharge from her blazing energy blade wrought havoc on her systems, gritting her teeth as electrical energy coursed through her chassis. The world spun around her, waves of dizziness and nausea passing through her. She'd lost count of how many times she'd fought Undyne. Between battles to the death, sparring sessions, competitions, although, technically, everything Undyne did, she turned into a competition, it had to have been 24 times or more. She'd thought she'd learned all of Undyne's moves. But with this new armor and new armaments, the captain was full of surprises. 2B struggled to parry every strike as Undyne's weapon shifted from a sword to a spear to a partisan and back, struggling to find an opening to land a hit of her own. While Undyne had so many new tricks up her sleeve, the tools and techniques at 2B's disposal weren't so fresh. That put 2B at a severe disadvantage. She just hoped she could hold out long enough for 9 seconds to come through for her. Racking her brain for a plan, she used the force of Undyne's attacks to drive herself backward and hasten her escape, trying to distract Undyne with a burst of gunfire from her pod, but Undyne had no intent on letting her run away. 2B glanced to her left and right, and at last she realized that she did have an advantage over Undyne. In all of their sparring matches, she and Undyne had only ever fought in wide-open, neutral locations, and in every situation more serious than that, they'd only ever fought on Undyne's turf. But this was an abandoned city just like the ones littering the surface of the planet, the same cities that inevitably became battlegrounds in the wars against the machines. This ancient, crumbling city, its walls and rooftops, its languishing remnants of civilization, was a familiar kind of battlefield. It suited 2B perfectly. Every single part of the environment was something she could use. "What's the matter?" Undyne taunted, her toes skimming the ground as she glided around 2B to block off her escape. As 2B did an about-face to keep her in her sights, a forest of spears burst from the ground behind her, penning her in. "Running away? I thought you were taking the fight to me." Hissing through gritted teeth, 2B pulled to the left and leaped at the wall. Her muscles coiling like springs, she ricocheted off, launching herself in the air and sailing over Undyne's head, landing behind the captain and stabbing at her back. It should have been easy for 2B to treat Undyne like just any other enemy. In the old days, she'd snuffed out the lives of machines, deserters from Yorha, and nines with equally dispassionate lack of prejudice. It was as simple as finding a weak point and exploiting it. And as she fended off Undyne's blows, she noticed plenty of weak points. The heavy nano-laminate armor that so easily shrugged off the long-range ordnance from her pod was incomplete and left Undyne's upper arms and legs, abdomen, and head far more vulnerable. Beneath that was Yorha armor, which was durable, but far less so. It would be easy to end this fight with a single fatal strike to any of those areas, or, preferably, a less-than-fatal strike. The sound of Undyne's energy sword roaring in her ear as the furious blade swung past her, 2B cut through Undyne's side, tearing a bloody gash in the black underlayer of her armor. At last, Undyne retreated, clutching her side as blood seeped through her fingers. Sputtering lances of lightning split off from her wings, coalescing and congealing into wicked spears and arrowheads that homed in on their target like a furious swarm of hornets. 2B dodged and weaved through them, buying herself a little more time as she put more distance between herself and her enemy. A few came close enough to numb her limbs, forcing her to stumble. Another burst of gunfire from her pod rid 2B of the last remaining stragglers flying after her. Undyne's new ranged attacks made her a more dangerous foe than ever before. What could 2B do to gain an advantage here? As Undyne charged at her, the ragged bursts of energy from her wing armatures raging like wildfire, 2B tossed the virtuous contract and joy use aside, freeing up her hands, and took hold of the shaft of Undyne's spear, ripping it out of her grip. The crackling energy blade sputtered and died as Undyne's hand left the spear's shaft. It had been cut off from the bottomless well of magical energy circulating through her armor. She threw it aside, summoned the virtuous contract back to her hand, and with a single swing of the white blade, sliced it in two. 2B's next swing of the blade struck Undyne, leaving only superficial scrapes and scratches on her armor, yet her attacks still knocked the captain backward. This armor was strong, it was resilient, but it was not physics-proof. 2B dove to the ground and slid beneath the sputtering wings flaring out from Undyne's back, her skull painfully throbbing from the wings' pulsing electrical aura as she rolled back onto her feet and attacked Undyne from behind. It took another strike to knock Undyne off her feet, another to throw her into the air, and a third. 2B leaped onto Pod 042 and launched herself off its hull to position herself above Undyne to slam her back down to the ground, the curtains of aquamarine light and lightning streaming from her wings shattering on impact with the worn stones lining the street. 2B brought her sword down for a fourth strike, the wind rushing through her ears and drowning out the lingering static plaguing her audio sensors. Undyne threw up her arms in an X shape over her chest, and the shining white blade clanged against her forearm guards. Blood sprayed from her mouth as her sharp fangs dug into her tongue, her arms trembled as she struggled against the force of 2B's attack. With a ragged, hoarse battle cry, she flung out her arms, knocking 2B backward and tearing the sword from her hands. Thanks to her NFCS, disarming 2B for any significant length of time was a fool's errand, but Undyne only needed a second to leap to her feet and grapple with her, twisting her arm and throwing her onto the ground. 2B recovered just as quickly as Undyne had, barely managing to block a salvo of energy spears with her shield as Undyne's wings flared back to life and the captain rose into the air once more. Damn it, not again, 2B thought. Undyne's flight capabilities were one advantage the captain had that she couldn't hope to surmount. Pod, engage missiles, she ordered Pod 042, and target Undyne's backpack. Pod 042's hull split open on command and let loose 3 missiles. Smoky gray trails of exhaust hung in the air as the missiles homed in on their target. Undyne climbed higher into the air, struggling to shake them off. She cut one in half with her energy sword, letting it explode harmlessly in the air, and dodged and weaved out of the way of the other 2, but was unable to shake them. 2B felt her spirits lift as she watched the other missiles draw closer and closer until Undyne threw up her arm and a ragged sheet of turquoise energy formed over it in a rough diamond shape. The missiles impacted against the shield and detonated, wreathing Undyne in a cloud of smoke. When the smoke cleared, the captain was completely untouched. 2B's face fell. What? Analysis: the Mobile Armor's EGM-FX-19A Infinite Justice's weapon and equipment loadout is as follows: Beam Partisan, 4. Flight Unit, 2. Beam Shield, 1. Beam Cannon. Beam Cannon. 2B asked, a chill running up her spine. She steeled herself as she looked up at Undyne. A beam of light tore itself loose from Undyne's forearm where the energy shield had been generated, searing the air around it and filling 2B's nostrils with the overwhelming odor of burnt ozone. 2B only just barely managed to avoid being struck by the beam, but found herself pelted by the debris from the crater it left in the street. Undyne kept firing, turning the street into a shooting gallery as 2B scrambled for shelter. According to Dr. Alphys' design documents, said Pod 042, the Infinite Justice's beam shield absorbs the kinetic energy of incoming projectiles and uses it to charge the beam cannon. You have access to Alphys' design documents? 2B asked, incredulous. Before she could leap through the window of a dilapidated shop for cover, another bolt from the heavens tore through it, reducing it to a blackened, smoking heap of rubble. Affirmative. Then tell me its weak points. The air fell silent, the roar of the energy blasts faded away. For once, all 2B could hear was her own heavy breathing over the pitched whirring of her black box. The Infinite Justice's beam cannon is part of a closed energy system, connected to the MCS solely via the beam shield, Pod 042 explained. This is to prevent it from draining the energy of the mobile armor's occupant. Hypothesis: Captain Undyne's beam cannon has just run out of energy. But Undyne wasn't down for the count just yet. A crackling spear buried itself in the ground at 2B's feet, and another, and 2B was once again forced to dodge another salvo of electrical blasts. Undyne swooped down, buzzing the rooftops as she strafed 2B. She still had plenty of means to attack from her vantage point in the air and plenty of open space to maneuver, and 2B was even further limited now that she knew that Undyne could simply soak up any of her pod's ranged attacks. The battle had shifted even further in Undyne's favor. As she braved the hail of lightning, 2B could feel her limbs growing heavier, her muscles growing stiffer. The longer she continued to fend off Undyne's attacks, the weaker she felt. To make matters worse, even narrowly avoiding or blocking the attacks wasn't enough to stop the electrical discharge from affecting her systems. She couldn't keep this up forever. Come on, Nines, she pleaded, all but praying for him to intervene. How long is it taking for you to hack into her armor? Hacking into Undyne's armor was, in fact, taking much longer than Nines had expected. He was almost insulted by how tough the security systems in place around the armor's MCS regulation programs were. Why would Alphys put these sorts of defense mechanisms in place? It wasn't like anyone but him had any hacking abilities down here. Nines discarded that line of thought. If there were anti-hacking measures in place around the MCS, it was probably just because it was a very delicate system, not because Alphys had intended to make this mobile armor into some kind of weapon perfectly tailored for kicking android ass. And if she had put these bothersome firewalls in place intentionally, then she'd probably been forced to do so by Chara. He lost his concentration as a digital defense turret targeted and fired on his avatar, knocking him out of Undyne's systems. His head throbbed and ached as a wave of static cascaded past his eyes and ears, deafening and blinding him for a few seconds as he staggered and stumbled backward. When his vision returned, he saw to his dismay that Undyne had taken to the air once again. Nines punched the ground. Damn it! It was hard enough to get a beat on Undyne when she wasn't flitting around like a wasp on amphetamines. He had to hack her to disable her wings, but he had to disable her wings to hack her. As he pulled himself to his feet, Nines heard Pod 042's voice echo in his head. Pod 042 to Unit 9s. This support unit proposes disabling the beam shield functionality of Captain Undyne's mobile armor. Yeah. Help me lock onto her first, Nines muttered, climbing onto a nearby rooftop and trying to focus on Undyne as she zipped through the air, and I'll do whatever you want. Nearby, a rickety tower loomed over the abandoned city, its apex nearly brushing against the roof of the vast cavern. Spying a tactical advantage, Nines hurried toward it. Once more, Undyne dive-bombed 2B, swooping low to the ground, carrying an acrid, bitter-tasting gust of wind in her wake. 2B raised her blades just in time to parry a strike from Undyne's blazing sword. However, the force of the blow, augmented by Undyne's free-fall acceleration and the thrust from her wings, was more than enough to knock 2B off her feet. The world spun incoherently around her, air and ground trading places with increasing rapidity before 2B felt herself collide with a stone wall, then another, until she landed on the smooth, worn stone surface of a nearly dry canal. Only the barest trickle of cool water ran down this long-forgotten structure, mingling with the blood dripping from 2B's forehead as she lay in a crumpled heap in the middle of the smooth, curved trench. 2B heard Nines call out her name as she struggled to her feet. Her side ached. When she'd hit the ground, the edge of the buckler on her right forearm had dug into it painfully, and 2B could feel blood from the wound adhering the wound to her shirt. This was bad. She wasn't wearing Undyne down. If anything, Undyne seemed to be growing stronger with every passing moment, whereas 2B was growing weaker. What would she have to do to stop this senseless violence? She couldn't so much as tire Undyne out, never mind talking her out of her bloodthirsty berserker rage. The words of an old mentor who had left her long ago rang in 2B's ears. Remember, pride, affection, happiness, sadness, love, hate, all androids must deny themselves these pleasures. But for a Type E especially, putting aside one's emotions is even more vital. 2B's inner voice, her conscience, had stopped referring to herself as 2E very soon after her first kill. She'd never wished to be a cold-blooded assassin, and her cover had given her an identity she could embrace in its stead. An ideal self, a version of herself she wouldn't have to carry such loathing for. That was who she had tried to be from the moment she had discovered that she and Nines had no way out of the underground. She didn't want to go back. But if Undyne was so desperate to return to the past, then 2B would show her what the past was really like. Her past. Pod 042 rejoined her just as Undyne charged full steam ahead, tearing through the hole 2B had made with reckless abandon. 2B grabbed hold of Pod 042's arm. Pod. Wire. Now, she shouted, throwing herself underneath Undyne. The pod shot out a yellow-white bolt of lightning of its own, latching onto Undyne's foot as the captain pulled back up and ascended once more. 2B clung to her pod with a white-knuckle grip, the wind rushing in her ears as Undyne carried her along as an unwelcome passenger. Undyne came to a stop, but carried by momentum, 2B kept sailing upward. Merely a split second after the wire connecting the two fighters disengaged, 2B reached her apex and began to fall. Clutching the pod to her chest, she fired on Undyne at point-blank range. The barely discriminate spray of bullets bounced harmlessly off of Undyne's thick outer layers of armor, but chewed through the thinner and less durable inner layer. As 2B fell, Undyne kicked the pod out of her hands, then launched a salvo of lightning-fast kicks into 2B's midsection. 2B hit the ground, sprawled out across the cracked and shattered stone road as a haze of pain engulfed her mind. If the sticky warmth spreading across her stomach was any indication, her pajamas were ruined, stupid thing to care about, now of all times. Above her, Undyne circled through the air in a ragged figure-8 pattern, as if keeping her distance. 2B's attack must have had an impact, but she knew full well that Undyne wouldn't back off or retreat. No matter how pointless it was, 2B would never reset, never, not after she'd promised 9S Undyne would keep fighting until one of them was dead, or both of them were. But, maybe Undyne was right. Maybe so many mistakes had been made in this timeline that there was nothing left to do but reset and try again. Reset and try again. Try again. Try again. Try again. Try again. Always trying again, erasing everything, good and bad alike, wiping the slate clean. In the back of her mind, 46 ghosts screamed at her not to give up, not to fill the afterlife with billions of ghosts from a timeline that had been unmade. 2B stood up, her shoulders sagging under the weight of her pain and exhaustion, but clenched her fists and gritted her teeth. I won't. Pod 042 returned to her side, looking only a little worse for the wear. It always surprised 2B just how much punishment tactical support pods could take, in certain circumstances. This support unit has a suggestion to improve Unit 2B's combat efficiency. Unit 2B's Heat Saber requires an external power source to perform at full capacity, it noted. Proposal: connect this support unit to the device. It was then that 2B recalled what Pod 042 had said about the switchblade affixed to her forearm when she'd received it. It had been designed based on the weaponry from the flight units she and Nines had arrived here in. 2B nodded. All right. Do it. Opening its clamshell hull, Pod 042 fished the tied-off bundle of cables out from under the buckler and ran it into its chassis. "This won't cause any problems, will it?" 2B asked, concerned. Pod 042 was as much her friend as anybody else down here, and her mind raced with all of the ways using it as a battery could go wrong. Its circuits could be fried, it could be shut down, it could wipe its internal memory and personality data. This support unit's long-range armaments may become unusable for an extended period of time, Pod 042 answered. However, permanent damage is unlikely. Her worries assuaged, 2B allowed Pod 042 to connect itself to the sword. When that was done, the blade began to hum and glow with a shimmering reddish-orange aura. Pod 042 hooked its arms around 2B's waist, letting her wear it like a backpack as it channeled the power from its propulsion system into the blade. Connection complete. 2B gave the heat saber an experimental swing, the blade leaving a ghostly orange afterimage smeared across the air. She raised her head. "Don't you understand, Undyne?" she cried out. "It's pointless. You'll never be able to erase the past." She'd hoped to goad Undyne into fighting her down here, where her heat saber could, hopefully, do some real damage to that suit of mobile armor. But instead, Undyne did something else. Even from his new vantage point atop the tallest structure he could find, a rickety, creaking tower made from stone and half-rotted wood, 9S struggled to lock onto Undyne. She was just too fast, too maneuverable. In terms of agility and speed, she put Yorha's best flight units to shame. Nines held out his hand, trying to follow Undyne's movements. He could feel his mind being pulled closer and closer to the computer systems of the captain's mobile armor. Almost there, almost there. Undyne spun on a dime and began firing spearheads at 9S's tower, grazing its decaying structure as she closed in on him. With every strike, the tower began to crumble. Damn. Nines packed up and hurried down the staircase, each step groaning in protest as the zero walls around him shook. How'd she figure out what I was doing? The tower trembled violently, its throws nearly tossing Nines off the winding staircase. Given a little more punishment, this thing would collapse right on top of him. Or does she know, Nines wondered, that if she kills me, 2B won't have any choice but to reset? Scanning his environment for a faster way out, Nines spied a narrow window, like the slits in castle walls used by archers in the distant past. It'd be a tight fit, but luckily for him, this whole tower was being held together by spit and prayers, and there weren't very many people here to do any praying. He threw himself out the window, his shoulders catching on the sides and tearing through the fragile stone as he leaped into open air. Fortunately enough, a two-story villa with a mostly intact roof lay beneath him to break his fall. Tucking in his legs, he hit the roof rolling as the upper levels of the tower he'd been sniping from sloughed off its rotting scaffolding and collapsed in on itself. Undyne took notice of him, readying a volley of spears. And froze in midair, surrounded by a ghostly blue aura. 2B despaired when she noticed where Undyne was headed, who she was headed toward. She couldn't bear to lose Nines. Not after all this. Not after he'd created so many fragile memories. At first, when Undyne stopped moving, 2B thought she'd somehow stopped time. But the flickering wisps of lightning streaming from Undyne's mechanical wings weren't frozen, they still lashed out, crackling and spitting with savage fury. Something else, somehow, had stopped Undyne in her tracks. 2B could see her straining and writhing against her frozen armor, struggling to move her limbs. Nines, did you do it? 2B wondered. Captain Undyne has been subdued, Pod 042 told Nines. Query, is this sufficient for Unit 9s to lock onto and hack the mobile armor? How? Nines asked. But before he could answer, the roof gave out beneath him. Shit, he cried out, fumbling for purchase. And then he stopped. He felt his insides twist around inside him as gravity ceased to apply to him. The same aura that had surrounded Undyne now wreathed his limbs. Standing on the intact edge of the roof were two skeletal monsters, one lanky, one short and stout. "Heya, kiddo," said Sans. "Looks like you aren't having a very good trip this fall." What's going on?" Nines asked as he found himself telekinetically lifted out of the hole and gently deposited onto a more stable section of the roof. And how long have you two been able to do this?" "Since forever," said Sans. "You never told me you could do that," Nines shouted. Sans shrugged. You never asked. One of your little robots called me. Papyrus exclaimed, brandishing his cell phone, and told me you needed help. He glanced at Undyne's frozen form, hanging in the sky. So, did Undyne's and 2BS sparring match get out of control again? Yeah, Nines lied. Looks like the bionic armor Undyne's been testing has a will of its own, it's going crazy up there. There was no need for Papyrus to know what had really happened to his mentor. And with her inside it? Yikes. Yikes is right. Nines lifted his arm and got a bead on Undyne. He wasn't sure how Sans and Papyrus had managed to stop her in her tracks like that, but he welcomed their assistance. Now just hold her steady while I hack into her armor. Papyrus cupped his hands around his mouth. You can do it, Undyne, he shouted out at her as she struggled against the aura holding her in place. You're stronger than that machine. I believe in you. Nines felt his mind sink into the computer systems of Undyne's armor, and he went to work, tearing through the virtual microcosm of the mobile armor as swiftly and deftly as he could. Whatever was holding Undyne in place gave way, dropping the captain to the ground. As soon as her feet touched the rough and battered cobblestone road, she charged at 2B, crossing blades. Orange sparks flew in showers from the energized heat saber as it ground against Undyne's crackling beam sword. Undyne, 2B said as she parried the captain's frenzied attacks, you need to stop this. You don't realize what you're asking me to do. The right thing. Undyne answered. For once in your life, 2B. 2B nearly pulled the sword from Undyne's hands with her next strike, then took advantage of her opening to cut a smoking, blackened gash through her chest plate with the heat saber. A shower of teal sparks gushed from the wound in the thick armor plating. The right thing? This world isn't a plaything you can just erase when it doesn't turn out your way. 2B retorted. I understand the pain you feel, and I know the past hurts, but you have to learn to live with it. Shut up. Undyne shouted. 2B gritted her teeth as she fended off another enraged blow from Undyne. What you're doing isn't noble or righteous, she told Undyne, digging in her heels. You're being a coward. She struck Undyne again, but this time, the captain raised her forearm and conjured her beam shield again. The glowing blade of 2BS heat saber ground against it, and the translucent shield flickered as it gorged itself on the blade's energy. Undyne grinned. I don't care if I'm a coward, she said. After all, in a few seconds, I won't exist. None of this will exist. Everything's going to go back to the way it used to be. No more Chara, and no more. Undyne's blackened eyes widened, her harsh snarl softening. Are you still gonna be friends with the next Undyne? 2B was caught off guard by Undyne's question, but at that same instant, the beam shield draining the energy from her saber vanished in a flurry of sparks and her blade, no longer deterred, cut another diagonal line through Undyne's chest plate, forming a smoking, charred X through the armor. Undyne staggered back, the electrical aura flowing from her wings flickering and firing from the skeletal wing scaffolding's emitters in ragged spurts. She clutched at her head, screaming, as electricity purged itself from her body and coursed through the mobile armor before exiting through the wings, the sheer magnitude of energy released blackening and charring the blue and white paint. At last, after an explosive burst of aquamarine electric discharge, the inoperative wing scaffolding protruding from her armor hung from her back like dead weight. 2B gritted her teeth and braced herself as the shockwave engulfed her, sending static and visual and audio artifacts rolling through her senses. The orange glow surrounding her heat saber dissipated, rendering the blade once more simply inert metal, and Pod 042 removed itself from 2BS back. The heat saber is no longer operable at max output, Pod 042 announced. That's okay, 2B said, sighing. I think it's... Even without her wings to aid her, Undyne still charged at 2B with just as much ferocity as before. Static fuzz ran across 2B's eyes as another spear crashed into her shield, sending tremors up her arm. The jagged spearhead lost its shape against the shield, deforming and splashing against the metal. Sparks kicked up from the impact swirled through the air. Those that drifted onto 2B's bare skin burned like acid. 2B's hand shot out and grabbed a fistful of Undyne's hair, feeling it tear from her scalp. The now dormant heat saber mounted on her forearm sliced through both Undyne's left eye and her left ear fin, leaving the fin's thin membrane torn, ragged, and bleeding. Undeterred, Undyne drove her kneecap the armor sharp and wickedly scalloped into 2B's stomach, puncturing her skin and scraping her armored chassis. Gasping and wheezing, 2B let go and stumbled back, quickly summoning her two swords back to her hands as Undyne assaulted her with another barrage of electric spearheads. Undyne's ruined left eye gushed blood. It streamed down her cheek, dripping off her chin and running down her neck, like a crimson waterfall, but a light still sparked from within its black depths, gouts of electric energy pouring out and drifting through the air around her. The two grappled, their hands clasping at each other's wrists and scrabbling for purchase. 2B shifted tactics, locking elbows with Undyne to free her hands. Undyne's sharp armor dug into her skin hard enough to cut through it, drenching her sleeves in blood. 2B conjured the joy used to her hand in a reverse grip and, slowly but surely, began to twist the blade, inching it closer and closer to Undyne's neck. Something hot pressed against her right bicep. 2B glanced at it and found a battered white cylinder in Undyne's left hand, her fist clenched around it in a death grip even as her two broken fingers stuck out at odd angles. Realizing what Undyne was about to do, 2B tried to pull away, but her hands were tied. Undyne had her pinned down. Undyne grinned viciously and ignited the blade for only a split second, but that split second alone was enough for the blade to bore a hole all the way through 2B's arm. 2B let out an ear-splitting, ragged scream and collapsed as Undyne tossed her aside. With so much pain coursing through her nervous system and howling through her brain, she barely felt herself hit the ground. Still, she pulled herself to her feet, clutching her arm as it dangled at her side. 2B and Undyne stood facing each other, both panting for breath, both struggling to stay standing. Undyne's eyes, jet black, were half closed, sweat made her ashen scales glisten. Her ear fins drooped and her scarlet hair was mussed and singed. Her exhaustion was more than apparent in every inch of her body. But sparks still flew from Undyne's body, and she still managed to put one leg in front of another as she came closer and closer to 2B. "I'm the hero," she rasped as she stumbled toward 2B. "I'm the one who's gonna fix the world. Alert, FFCS and NFCS inoperable," Pod 042 warned 2B. Sure enough, she couldn't summon any sword to her hand. Her right arm hung limply at her side, the inoperative buckler and heat saber hanging from it like a lead weight. Long and short-range attacks are no longer possible. Proposal: retreat immediately and perform temporary repairs before re-engaging in combat. Undyne continued to inch closer. Right all the wrongs, make everything back like it should be. Undyne, 2B squeezed her arm where it hurt the most, as if doing so could squeeze the pain from her flesh. If only she'd woken up sooner, if only she'd managed to be there for her friends when they'd needed her the most, if only, if only. "I can't erase this world," 2B said. "All of the lives of everybody down here, and on the surface, unmade." In an instant, she fell to her knees as Undyne trudged closer. I can't let you do that. All my life, the only thing I've been good at has been killing." Tears began to leak from her eyes. "I can't go back to that. I can't do it. I can't kill the world. I promised. I promised." Undyne loomed over her. The closer she came to 2B, the more unwell she looked. The dark rings under her eyes, the grayish pallor of her normally brilliant blue scales, the gauntness of her face. These last few weeks must have been hell on her. And for it to all come to a head like this. 2B wasn't sure she could fully understand the full extent of the turmoil of Undyne's mind, but what she could understand filled her heart with pity. "And you can't do it either," 2B told her. "I know. Undyne, you've always been better than me. I'm just a murderer. You're a hero. No matter how many of our fights I won. I could never live up to you, Undyne. You were always so brave, so bold. You lived by your principles. All I ever knew how to do was follow orders, no matter how much they hurt. The more I got to know you, the more I looked up to you, as the person I could have been, as the person I should have been. I've never been a good friend, have I?" 2B let out a weak, bitter laugh. "I can't help but feel that you've learned from me as much as I've learned from you." She thought back to 14E, 6E, Commander White, the women who'd taught her, who'd shaped her. They'd all been lousy teachers, and so, it seemed, was she. As she stood before 2B, words from a dream ran through Undyne's head. Words from a nightmare that had hooked its talons into the real world. We have a shared duty, Undyne. Adopted children of royalty, bound not by blood, but united with a common purpose. Chara had said, pulling the flower from their eye, blood running from its burned socket like tears down their pale cheek. In your heart, you know I'm right. Stay with your friends and abandon everything you claim to stand for, just as father did, or stand with me, and save the world. Her friends, or the world. Kill 2B, fix the timeline, or... She reached out with a trembling hand. Laid it on 2B's shoulder. 2B knelt, immobilized, and exhausted, as Undyne's gauntleted hand slid up her neck and her fingers curled around her throat. And she began to squeeze. Undyne stood in the snow, shivering as the cold air chilled the sweat coating her scales. She was utterly exhausted, and so was 2B. They were all out of weapons, all out of magic, and neither had the energy to even throw a punch anymore, let alone a spear. You fall first, said Undyne, pointing at 2B as she swayed on unsteady legs. No, 2B retorted, smiling faintly. You fall first. No, you, said Undyne. This was her and 2B's 13th sparring match. 2B had won 6. Undyne had won 6. The tiebreaker match was not going to go to 2B. Undyne would make sure of it. 2B took a step forward and nearly fell over. It's over. Yeah, Undyne tried to step forward, but felt the world spin around her. For you. She grabbed 2B by the wrist and the two of them fell into the snow at the exact same time. Undyne hated the cold more than anything, but she was too tired to get up. It's a tie, said 2B, sighing. Snowflakes settled on her black jacket, dotting it like the tiny diamonds dotting the ceilings of the tunnels deep in Waterfall, like the stars in the sky Undyne had always heard so much about. Yeah, said Undyne, sighing more heavily as the falling snow tickled her fins, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Hey. If I pass out first, you gotta drag me to Papyrus House. Or Grillby's. Whatever's closer. I'll freeze to death out here. What if I pass out first? Undyne laughed. Then we die. Then perish. No, no, no. Undyne tugged on 2B's sleeve. We gotta have a rematch tomorrow. Oh, all right. 2B began to pull herself up, but wavered, so Undyne took hold of her and propped her up. The two of them rose on unsteady feet, their arms slung over each other's shoulders, and began to trudge through the snow like a lumbering, ungainly four-legged creature. Any broken parts or anything? Undyne asked 2B, eyeing a long, purplish-black bruise on the side of her right hand. That was the same hand Alphys kept having to repair. Just a little worn out. 2B smiled, her cheeks flushed from exertion and the cold. How about you? It was hard for Undyne to believe that just a few months ago, 2B had been a quiet, emotionally repressed, stoic weirdo. Now she was just a quiet, stoic weirdo. A cute, quiet, stoic weirdo. Not as cute as Alphys, though. Well, cuter in a different way, but not as cute in other ways. Important ways. One thing 2B did have over Alphys, though, was that out of every living thing on the planet she probably had the most perfectly shaped A. How about you? 2B asked. Huh. Undyne hadn't been listening. Nothing broken. Undyne couldn't help but laugh. You aren't that good, she told her. We'll see, 2B said. Excuse me. We're having a rematch tomorrow, aren't we? We'll see. I can let go of you and just leave you here in the snow, Undyne warned her as the facade of Grillby's pub drew closer. Kman. Let's get something to eat. Grillby's was warm and inviting as always. It was hard not being warm when the bartender was a fire elemental and, of course, Undyne was very well known in there. Most of its regular patrons were her subordinates. One big, hot, thick, greasy, dripping burger later, Undyne was feeling like her old self again. At her side, 2B carefully cut her burger into manageable pieces with a fork and knife, a napkin spread out over her lap. That's not how you. Table manners are important, 2B insisted as she daintily ate every bite-sized piece one by one. Undyne shook her head and sighed. She was 100% certain that 2B only did that to annoy her. The night wore on. Undyne kept drinking. So did 2B, although after the 15th pitcher of beer between the two of them, Undyne was starting to believe 2B when she said that alcohol didn't do anything to Yorha models. Are you okay? 2B asked as Undyne almost stabbed her own hand with her fork. She'd been trying to mock 2B's ironclad adherence to fancy dining decorum by chopping up her fifth burger of the night, but she was rapidly losing her ability to aim her utensils. "'Kay? Yeah, I'm okay," Undyne said. Her words sounded slurred even to her own earphones, a sure sign that she was probably too drunk now to keep drinking. "I'm the queen of okay. I'm Mrs. Okay," she hiccuped. "Miss Okay," she corrected, leaning against 2B's shoulder as she twirled her fork, dropped her fork, picked up her knife, twirled her knife, and then dropped it on the floor as well. "But we could be Mrs. Ok's." She rested her hand on 2B's collar, tracing the edges of her collarbone in what she hoped was a very suggestive way. "I'm not interested," 2B said coolly, delicately removing Undyne's hand from her shoulder, "in coming between you and Alphys." "Sorry." "Oh, only come in between you'll be doing is, double entendres? Forget those." Undyne's brain only had enough power in it for single entendres now. She tried to swagger without getting up off her stool and nearly fell off, only for 2B to catch her. "Maybe you've had enough to drink," 2B told her. "Kman. Haven't I heard a polyamory?" 2B raised her eyebrows quizzically. "No. It's when," Undyne hiccuped and felt something trying to crawl up her throat. She swallowed it back down. Was Grilby standing too close to her? She felt hot. Really hot. Hot like just walked through Hotland to see Alphys hot. She bent over to pick up her fork and knife again. Or, well, tried to. Eventually, 2B just gave her hers. "Yeah. Okay, so," Undyne held up the fork in one hand and knife in the other. "We got 2 hands, right? For 2 swords. 2 spears. 2 whatever you want." She raised the fork, then the knife. "You. Alfie." She shoved the utensils back into 2B's hands, then grabbed her by the wrists and raised each hand in turn as 2B sat there, a bemused look on her face. "Me. Alfie." Then Undyne pried the fork and knife out of 2B's hands, held them out, and dropped them onto the floor. "Okay, that's where Alphys posed to pick 'em up." Undyne gestured to the fork. "Me," she gestured to the knife. "You." With her explanation finished, she grinned a toothy grin. "Polyamory." 2B looked at her, still utterly bemused, her mouth slightly agape. "So, dual wielding." Undyne nodded so vigorously that she got motion sickness. "Yeah. But for girlfriends. The 3 of us," she said, "could all be each other's girlfriends. What do ya think?" I think you should ask Alphys," 2B stammered, her face reddening. "You know she'd be down for it. So, how about it?" "Huh." Undyne leaned in closer to 2B. "Huh." She leaned in even closer to 2B. "Huh." She leaned in even closer to 2B and toppled over. 2B caught her as she fell and all but dragged her out of Grilby's. "Come on, Undyne. I'll get you a room at the inn." Undyne wiggled her eyebrows suggestively. "Make sure to accidentally rent a room with only 1 bed," she said. Then she burped, puked, and passed out. Undyne shuddered under 2B's gaze. 2B looked into her eyes expectantly, as if trying to divine her thoughts through them. Her gaze from behind disheveled, matted, and blood-stained snow-white bangs was piercing and, somehow, accusing. It was the same as last time. Undyne had 2B at her mercy. But she couldn't do it. Even after all this, even at the end of all things, even after the heartbreak and pain, even after watching the decay of the world she'd been so proud of, even after seeing her resolve crumble before her eyes, Undyne couldn't do this. 2B was, and always would be, her friend. She hated herself for being unable to go through with her plan, but she hated herself just as much for wanting to do it in the first place. What had happened to her? What had happened to the spear of justice? How could she have allowed herself to be reduced to this? Undyne hadn't fully realized the extent to which Chara had seeded her mind. She'd tried so hard to block them out, but all this time, they'd been planting their own twisted ideas into her mind, watering them, nurturing them like the flowers in Ascari's beloved garden. but Chara had failed. They couldn't turn Undyne into them, no matter how hard they'd tried to poison her. You don't sacrifice friends for the greater good. You don't cut down the people you love for standing in your way. That wasn't what a hero of justice did. That wasn't what a hero of anything did. That wasn't what Undyne did. Since she'd stumbled upon Alphys' remains, Undyne had felt like all her thoughts were trudging through a field of mud, sluggish, slow, muddled, and murky. But now, at last, her mind felt clear. She laid her hands, both of them, on 2B's shoulders, the two broken fingers on her left hand smarting, and pulled 2B into a hug, burying her face in her chest as she let loose hours worth of repressed sobs. 2B's shirt was so soft, so. It was her pajamas. All along, she'd been trying to kill a girl in her pajamas. The two of them knelt there on the ground, silent save for Undyne's quiet, muffled tears. In the end, she couldn't do it. In the end, she knew that she couldn't have ever done it in the first place. "I'm sorry," Undyne sobbed. "I'm so sorry, 2B, please." 2B slowly, gingerly wrapped her arm around Undyne's waist and hugged her. Nines leaped into view, bearing his sword. "Undyne," he shouted out. "Don't you dare, hurt, 2B." The world began to fade to black around Undyne as she murmured her desperate apologies to 2B, and as the darkness closed in, she wondered if this was the end. It was okay if it was. Maybe then, she'd see Ascari and Alphys again. Pod 042's monotone voice echoed in the void. Incoming transmission. Source unknown. The next thing Undyne heard before everything went black was a familiar voice. "Yuan, Dyne, Ar-U-Th there." Chapter 57, E-Voices of the Dead. The first thing Undyne felt was a soft pressure on her hand. She wasn't sure if she was alive or dead. Everything was black as pitch, black as the deepest depths of the mountain, and quiet as the grave. Was this her grave? Alphys. Her timid, nasally voice still rang in Undyne's earphones. There was nothing for it to compete with. How wonderful that she had been able to hear it one last time, although she had to laugh at the absurdity of it all. The bridges Undyne had burned had been leading the way back to her all along. Dynes. P please, B-O-OK. Dyne. Real sound rang like a bell in the void. Her voice, strained and pained as if she had to fight to force each word from her mouth, but so much like music to Undyne's ears. Or, well, ear. She could only hear out of one of them. Everything on her left side sounded muffled. A blurry crack formed in the darkness, ushering in blinding light as it widened, and slowly, inching forward bit by bit, the world around Undyne sharpened into focus. "See? I told you she'd pull through," Papyrus exclaimed, a twinkle in his eye sockets as he nudged Alphys with a bony elbow. His brother stood at his side as he knelt at the ground, and across from him, on Undyne's other side, was a looming skeletal monster with a long, bestial skull. "Papyrus? Sans? Gabrietta? What were they doing here? How had they gotten here?" Alphys all but lunged at Undyne, burying her snout in the crook of her neck. "Why Yuri, alive, are really, alive. You I told you," Undyne croaked as she lifted her leaden arm. Slightly luminous yellow-green threads spooled from the seams of her black armor and laid her hand on Alphys' back, her throat as dry and rough as sandpaper, not to use that nickname. She glanced at her side and saw, off in the distance, a shot-off pile of blue and white armor. Her armor, the outer layer, at least. It was scarred, blackened, and seemed to have been separated from the inner layer in a hurry. "Sure our lucky nines shut down your armor," Papyrus was babbling in her ear. "I can't imagine how scary it must have been to have that thing controlling." Undyne tuned him out. All she cared about was the soft pressure of Alphys' body resting atop hers. All her anguish, all her pain, all her heartbreak, and in the end, it had all been okay all along. Alphys was here. How had she gotten here? A question for another day. She was here and that was what mattered. She hadn't been torn away from Undyne like Ascari had. "In case you were wondering how these two got here so quickly," said Sans, as if he could read her mind, "let's just say I know a few, shortcuts." Barely paying attention to him, Undyne dragged her fingers along Alphys' spine. "Alfie. I'm so happy to see you again. I thought I never would. So, W was worried so much. Are you okay? Are you hurt? Undine asked Alphys as she whimpered into her shoulder. How did you survive? I saw your coat, and your glasses, and your dust. The words caught in her throat, and her next words came out mingled with a sob. I'd have done anything to see you again, Alfie. I thought I could, but I. Alfie's little claws dug into Undine's sides. We. Gigao, BB. Gigi Gabby and. Gabrietta patted her on the head, then turned to face Undine. She's suffered damage to the language center of her brain, she signed. Undine, her mind still hazy, struggled to follow along with the doctor's frantic gestures. It's hard for her to talk. You shouldn't push her. Undine nodded, giving Alphys a firm, yet gentle squeeze. Alphys could be a real chatterbox when she was waist-deep in one of her special interests. Hopefully, she'd get better soon, having all that bottled up in her head, having so much to say and so many questions to answer but not being able to do so, seemed to Undine like the smart person's equivalent of a broken leg. Well, maybe she could write it down. Undine asked Gabrietta, forcing a smile. Gabrietta looked away. Like I said, she signed, damage to the language center of her brain. Undine's face fell and she glanced again at Alphys, who still had her face buried in her shoulder. Don't cry, she consoled her, struggling to sit up. Everything hurt, everything ached, her fingers and her ribs were howling and burning white-hot in protest and trying her best to hold Alphys in her lap. It's okay, your brain's gonna heal up sooner or later. Alphys choked back a sob and nuzzled the side of Undine's neck harder, her snout brushing against her sensitive gills. Undine's breath grew short. However long it takes, she continued, I'm gonna be there for you until you're all better. And then I'll be there for you after that. You know why? Alphys merely clung to Undine more tightly, stifling a forlorn moan. Gabrietta tapped her on the shoulder. Undine, she signed once she'd gotten Undine's attention, I need to explain something to you. Your body has been producing lethal amounts of DT energy. Undine sat and stared, dumbfounded, as Gabrietta explained what had happened to her. Her body was, in a sense, so abundant with life that it was barely holding itself together. Her armor's circulatory system, which siphoned and redistributed the magic in her body, was the only thing keeping her from literally falling apart at the seams. But Undine's stores of magic were all but depleted. Now, the only magic flowing through the inner layer of her mobile armor was Gabrietta's own healing magic. Maybe it would keep her together for a few days. A week, if she was expecting a miracle. A few hours in a worst-case scenario. The news settled in Undine's gut like a basketball made of lead. She'd known ever since she'd awoken this morning that she was burning herself up to nothing, that her time in this world was short, but to hear a real medical expert confirm that feeling made it all the more real, and all the more horrifying. She was going to die. She was really going to die. Every single cell in her body, every scale, every fang, every strand of hair felt like a time bomb waiting to go off. And she didn't want it anymore. She wanted to spend the rest of her life with the people who mattered to her, the people she still had, people like Alphys, and Papyrus, and Jerson, and she wanted it to be a long life, a good life. She wanted to live. She curled up around Alphys, squeezing her eyes shut to try and stop her own tears from flowing. Don't worry, Papyrus assured her with his usual bright, overly loud, chirpy voice. I'm positive you two will both be right as rain in no time at all. He can't read sign language, Sans whispered in Undine's ear. Sure I can. Papyrus retorted. And I still think you're gonna be fine, he said, clapping Undine on the shoulder. That's how much I believe in you. With an aching hand, Undine wiped away her tears and cracked a bittersweet smile. Thanks, Papyrus. I knew I could count on you, for a vote of confidence. I won't let you down. But she hoped he'd forgive her if she did. Of course he would. He was Papyrus. But still. She set Alphys aside and stood up, her knees creaking and protesting. Strands and loops of Gabrietta's magical medical threads dangled from every seam and joint in her armor, all faintly shimmering. With whatever limited time she still had left in this world, there was someone else she had to make amends to. On the other side of the crumbling cobblestone street was another group attending another injured person. 2B lay on the ground, attended by the other two androids and Toriel. As Undyne stumbled closer, waving off Papyrus' assistance so she could have at least some semblance of privacy, she soon noticed that triage here did not seem to be going so smoothly as it had under Gabrieta's supervision. Undyne's heart sank. She couldn't have hurt 2B that badly in the fight, could she have? 2B was curled up on the ground, her knees tucked up to her chest, clutching at the thin black jacket wrapped around her fleece nightshirt, trembling like a leaf. Toriel was tugging at her jacket to no avail. 2B, please, my child. Let us see where you are hurt, she said. Just let me. She tugged harder at 2B's shoulder, trying to get a better look at whatever damage she had incurred as the android struggled against her. Her tone became terse. Evidently, she had been struggling with 2B for quite some time already. 2B. You are behaving childishly. I can help you. Dr. Alphys is here as well, and the best surgeon in the kingdom, but we cannot do anything for you if you do not cooperate with me. Please. Just tell me where it hurts. 2B simply curled up tighter, mumbling something incoherent. As Undyne drew closer, she could see streaks of tears glittering on her cheeks. Was she even awake, or just thrashing around in the throes of a daytime nightmare? Toriel shook her head and sighed, exasperated. Use your words, dear. Nines, the first to notice Undyne, pulled himself to his feet, scowling at her as he stomped toward her. His clenched fist shook. What, he snarled, giving her a withering glare, did you do to her? 2B did what she did best and closed herself off. Her mind was as hazy as it was tumultuous. Whatever thoughts she tried to dwell on slipped out of her grasp, as if she were trying to hold on to a cloud. She couldn't focus. She couldn't help but tune out the words of the people surrounding her, the hands grasping at her. They all slid off her sensors like water off of Teflon. All she could do was cling to herself, pulling herself as far away from the world as possible, fighting back tears and losing. It felt like she had been that way forever. She wasn't even aware of her surroundings anymore. It had all faded into a blank haze. It was all her fault. She couldn't escape who she was, after all. A dear friend was at death's door and she was to blame. In the end, 2B couldn't help but kill the ones she loved. She'd tried to be her old self. That had been the worst of it. She'd tried to channel her past, that callousness she could turn off and on like a switch, and it just hadn't come. She should have felt grateful to have lost that hated part of herself, but maybe that had been the part of herself that had made her strong. Maybe she was useless without it. Well, a familiar voice whispered softly in her ear. A familiar face swam in front of her eyes, blurred by her tears. A face framed by curled, whitish-violet hair, its roundness and softness belying the cruelty of the woman who bore it, the body behind it shrouded in mist. What do we have here? 2B blinked. She had to be dreaming, although she couldn't remember ever having fallen asleep. You're dead, she wanted to say, but the words wouldn't come out. I killed you. You murdered Mom and I. You don't look so good, Tui. Do you feel good? 6E asked, her voice honeyed as always. She crouched down in front of 2B, curled her fingers beneath her chin, and lifted her head so the two of them were staring eye to eye. 2B turned her head and glanced away. The world around her was foggy and indistinct. Tui, 6E's fingers slid up to 2B's cheeks, and with a stern grip she led 2B back to face her. You've really made a mess of things here, haven't you? Let go of me, 2B stammered, feeling icy tendrils worm their way up her spine. 6E did exactly the opposite, and her hands slid back up to the sides of 2B's neck, her fingertips running in little circles along the back of her neck. 2B squeezed her eyes shut. You're dead. I killed you. Go away. Come back with me. 2B's eyelids fluttered open in shock at the request as she struggled to process its absurdity, 6E's face sharpening into focus before her. Be but the bunker. 6E giggled. All you have to do is reset, you silly girl. She tousled 2B's hair, her fingertips roughly brushing across her scalp. You know what to do to come back. So just do it. Come back here. You'll be happier. I'm happy here, 2B insisted. You were, 6E corrected. But now. She cocked her head like a confused dog. It all really fell apart, didn't it? Are you happy down here now? 2B dodged the question. I can't go back. Like I told you last time, I can't go back. 6E stood up, putting her hands on her hips. Why? Because you've changed. A pause hung in the air, and as she struggled to find an answer, 2B wrapped her arms around herself. Oh, you've changed, all right, 6E continued. You've learned to smile, to laugh, to whittle away your days with idle amusements and diversions, but have you changed for the better? 2B curled up tighter, burying her face against her knees, afraid of the answer to that question. She hadn't changed. Beyond the superficial differences between herself and 2E, she was just as rotten on the inside. Civilian life doesn't suit you, 2E, 6E said. All it's done is corrupt you. It's made you soft and weak. We androids weren't built for it, it's no surprise what it's done to you. You used to be the ultimate ascetic, never refusing to put comfort ahead of duty. Now, here you are. Shut up. Look at yourself. Look deep inside, at how selfishly you cling to your little friends and your little family and your little life, even if it means choosing ruin over greatness. 6E crouched down to bring herself eye level with 2B again and reached out to her. Her left eye turned bright scarlet, a golden flower appeared over her right eye, translucent and flickering like an unstable hologram, a circlet of thorny vines snaked through her curled locks. Look at how weak it's made you. 2B swatted her hands away. Shut up. Little 2E, little frightened girl, hiding from the greater duties the world has placed on you, she continued, adding a sing-songy lilt to her voice. Hiding away in your little hole, clutching your little treasures to yourself, begging your mommy to indulge you and treat you like the child you've always so desperately wanted to be. 6E laid her hands on 2B's shoulders, gripping them tightly. 2E, listen to me. We want to. 2B snapped awake, the mist vanishing around her. In an instant, 6E's face became 6O's, framed by pleated blonde tresses. There was no trace of malice in that face. Her eyes were wide with concern. Help you. We just want to help you, 2B. Are you? Without hesitation, ignoring the pain racking her body, 2B flung her arms around 6O, taking shuddering breaths to calm her nerves and force down the lump in her throat. She could taste salt on her own lips, but she wasn't crying, at least not anymore. Instead, she just felt empty, exhausted, spent, and not just physically, but emotionally as well. It was as though her insides had been scooped out. 6O snaked her fingers through her hair, gently brushing her fingertips across her scalp. We were getting so worried, she told her. You weren't responding to anything we said or did. I was, dreaming, 2B mumbled, still a little dazed and reeling. She shook off how real that vision of 6E had felt, more like a psychotic episode than a nightmare, and resolved to perform a thorough diagnostic as soon as she could, just to make sure nothing was permanently damaged. Androids weren't meant to see, hear, or feel things that weren't there while they were awake, and certainly not all three. I think. Toriel's paws landed gently on her shoulders. My dear, I am so sorry. We did not know whether you were asleep or awake. I was growing a little frustrated. Now, can you tell us where it hurts? Everywhere, 2B said. How's Undyne? A loud, resounding crack echoed through the air, turning every head in the area. Well enough for 9 seconds to slap her across the face, 6O responded, cringing. 2B doesn't wear her heart on her sleeve like you, Undyne. 9's all but screamed at Undyne as he stood in front of her. Within seconds, Toriel had already rushed over to him and restrained him, hoping to pull him away from Undyne before he could get any more violent. The black-cloaked surgeon with the long, skeletal face and papyrus did the same for Undyne. Do you know why? Do you have any idea why? 9S, please. Toriel scolded him. Despite her efforts, he wouldn't budge, as if his feet were rooted to the ground. Do not assault her. She is dying. You think just because she's stoic means you can say whatever hurtful things you want to her? She doesn't wear her heart on her sleeve because it's fragile. 9's shouted out, still pouring his ire on Undyne as she stood there like a statue, a fresh bruise welling up on her cheek. So whatever sick lies you told her to make her like this, you'd better take them all back, or I swear I'll. Despite 6OS protestations, 2B forced herself to her feet. Nines, she weakly called out. He didn't hear her. Stumbling on unsteady legs like a newborn fawn, she staggered toward him, calling out his name again, until she was close enough to grab his hand. Nines. Nines lost his train of thought, the rage evaporating from his face as he turned to look at 2B. Oh, he mumbled sheepishly. T2. 2B, you're okay. I just had a little mental breakdown, 2B said. I'm fine now. Undyne, what about you? Undyne stood before her. Faintly glowing threads of healing magic hung off of every joint and seam of the scuffed and tattered black Yorha body armor she still wore, and the furthest thing she looked from was healthy. Her face was haggard and gaunt, ragged strips of a scarf as red as her hair, papyrus scarf, which he'd eagerly converted to bandages for her, circled her head to cover her mutilated eye and ear. Her one good eye was still jet black, a single white pinprick blazing amid the ebony sclera, a faint sheen of sweat coating her scales made her look almost as though she were melting. At her midriff, where 2B had torn through her armor and perforated her torso with machine gun fire, every inch of bare skin and more was wrapped in a thick layer of bloody gauze laced with glowing threads. She looked like a raggedy, threadbare, patchwork doll. Never better, she croaked, giving a pained thumbs up. 2B couldn't read the hand signs of the surgeon standing at her side and propping her up, but whatever she was trying to say, it was probably contradictory to Undyne's sentiments. All the same, 2B reached out and hugged her, or, more accurately, tripped over herself and fell into her, resting her cheek against her breastplate as she hung her left arm over the captain's shoulder for support. The black-cloaked surgeon, evidently irate over the way her patient was being manhandled, tried to drag Undyne away, but Undyne brushed her aside. 2B, she said, lowering her voice, I've got some stuff I need to say to you. She took a seat on the ground, pulling 2B down with her. 2B didn't protest. She already dreaded whatever Undyne was about to say. Undyne sighed, raising her head to stare up at the ceiling. You know, people who have all the power to change things for the better, but won't get off their asses and do it, they piss me off. 2B should have known better than to expect sympathy. She bowed her head in shame. Undyne, I'm sorry. I understand why you think resetting would be in everyone's best interest. I know it's selfish and childish of me to cling to this world when we've lost so much, but... 2B thought about Nines, the number of times he'd only lasted a few days before she'd had to kill him, how hard it always had been to see such a simple smile on his face when he met her for the first time, for the 17th, 18th, 19th, umpteenth time, the pain in her chest, the hollowness, how it grew worse and worse every time. To suffer through that again with Undyne, Alphys, Toriel, those friendships, those family ties would exist only in her head. In the new world, the one created by turning back time, those memories would be as unreal as delusions. She had always been drawn to self-sacrifice like a moth to flame. It was a symptom of having to deny everything that was precious to her over and over again for so long. Perhaps now she was overcompensating, forcing herself to put her wants ahead of everything else just to keep herself from ending it all. Organizing her thoughts like that, it just sounded petulant of her. But I can't describe, 2B said, how much it hurts. Oh, I wasn't talking about you. Undyne said. That fucking Sans can go wherever he wants in the kingdom in the blink of an eye and never thought to help us out until now? Fuck that guy. 2B laughed in spite of herself, a sharp ache running through her stomach. She clutched at her side, the damp bloodstain marring her shirt still warm against her palm. Undyne laid a hand on 2B's knee. You know, Ascari, he was the nicest, kindest, sweetest guy. And it's been hard for me to accept that he could have gone and freed us whenever he wanted. I just can't imagine what he must have been thinking that kept him from doing that. Her voice broke. I can't understand him, and it hurts to know he failed us like that, but I'll still always love him, and I'll still always miss him. Lately, I've been seeing a lot of people I care about end up like that, she said. And I've seen what it looks like when you're willing to do whatever it takes to reach your goals, no matter who gets caught in the crossfire. I'm the one who should be beating myself up over this. I threw out every single one of my values. I never imagined I could sink so low. You still tower over me, 2B muttered. I've become too selfish. In the old days, I never allowed myself anything. I never allowed myself to grow close to anybody because I knew I'd have to toss them aside eventually. Then I came here, and suddenly I had friends, family, a mother, and for them, I told myself I'd fight it. I'd fight all my instincts that told me to throw away my own happiness for the greater good. Because my happiness was their happiness. And theirs was mine. But, 2B raised her blood-stained hand in front of her and let it fall limply to her side. Look what it's done to us. Gotta have balance, I guess, Undyne mumbled. Sorry. For beating the hell out of you. And, she said a little louder, paying a glance at Nines as he fumed at her, for all the shit I said to you. I'm sorry, too. I didn't mean it, Undyne said. Neither did I, said 2B, although she was sure neither of them fully believed the other. Just trying to push your buttons. You know. Looks like I pushed them too well, huh. 2B sighed. I just wish I'd been there for you. It's okay, Undyne said. I almost thought everyone had let me down, Askari, Jerson, you, but it was me all along who'd been failing me. Undyne leaned onto 2B's shoulder. 2B couldn't believe she was being so kind to her. Did she really deserve this? I wasn't lying, 2B said, when I told you I'd set a checkpoint this morning. You just figured out how to do that? Undyne asked, her shoulders shaking as she suppressed a bitter laugh. Boy, would that have come in handy about 2 months ago. I know. 2B nodded. I could go back there. We'd only lose a few hours, she rationalized, and I can live with that, if it means you. Undyne was silent for a few moments, staring down at her wounded body with a heavy, half-lidded eye. I dunno. I'd just fight you all over again, I think. I'd do better next time. Pfft. Fuck you, no, you won't. Undyne snorted, that familiar competitive gleam in her eye. Don't worry about me, 2B. I'll be fine. 2B tried a different approach. I could heal you if I gave you my. Nope. End of story. I'm gonna be fine. Besides, if you sacrifice a single thing for me, I'm pretty sure Nines is gonna kill me. It went without saying that 2B didn't believe her, but the question was settled. Before she knew it, Undyne had her in a headlock and was vigorously rubbing her knuckles against 2B's scalp, ruffling her hair into an unkempt mop. I love and support you, damn it, so don't you dare threaten to give up your life or whatever shit for my sake. It was the warmest, fondest, gentlest nudge 2B had ever received. 2B couldn't believe Undyne still thought of her as a friend after all this. Undyne let go of 2B and stood up, looming above her. Even weak and weary as she was, she still looked like a colossus. Reaching out, she took 2B's wrist. Kman. Let Gabrietta take a look at you. Between her and Nines, I'm sure we can get you feeling a little better. The anxious hollow in her stomach vanishing, 2B obliged to let the black-cloaked skeleton work on her while Undyne hung back with Alphys. Dr. Gabrietta did her work in silence with Pod 042 keeping watch over 2B and advising her and Papyrus translating her occasional flurries of hand gestures into speech. Nines joined in, addressing the damage to 2B's chassis while Gabrietta and the faintly glowing magical thread she spun from her bony fingers mended the damage to her skin and muscles. There wasn't much that could be done for the charred coin-sized hole tunneling through 2B's arm that left everything below her shoulder more or less dead, but between the doctor's healing thread, liberal applications of staunching gel, some sealant applied to her chassis, and a few vaguely fruit-flavored juice boxes that had been procured from Emil's cart, 2B felt shockingly close to healthy, or, at the very least, far away from dead. Nines took her right arm, lifted it, and let it fall limply to her side. What is it? He asked, glancing at the unwieldy machine arm grafted to his right shoulder, with us and mangling our arms. I'd rather lose an arm than a leg, said 2B, sitting up and fumbling with the buttons of her liberally blood-stained nightshirt. A few of the cartoon bunnies printed on the fleece fabric still poked their heads out from under the drying burgundy stains. I am not sure, Toriel muttered as she handed 2B another juice box. A broken leg would certainly keep you two out of trouble. I'm pretty sure if you ever lost a leg, Nines said, you'd just do a handstand and start walking on your hands. He reached over and tried to help 2B with the buttons, but with one hand, he was about as useless as 2B, and his mechanical claw was not a nimble replacement for his other hand. I've got this for you, 60 announced, leaning in and buttoning up 2B's shirt, the giddy grin on her face making it plain that she was reveling in being the only one of the three with two functioning hands. Her fingers slipped as though they were coated with oil when she set to work, though, most likely because she was clearly getting flustered every time they brushed against 2B's bare skin. After a few mumbled apologies, 60 finished. All done, she chirped, leaning back to admire her handiwork. Her smile immediately shrank when she noticed that the buttons were misaligned. Wait. Let me try again. It's fine, 2B insisted. You can retry as many times as you want once things settle down. 60 smirked at this remark, her smile dripping with innuendo. Toriel shrank away, a faint reddish tinge beneath the fur on her cheeks. Nines buried his face in his hand and shook his head. Once things settle down. 2B wondered why she'd said that. Things had settled down now, hadn't they? Or was something deep inside her warning her that some new danger was emerging over the horizon? Toriel pursed her lips, casting a worried glance around the quiet street. Where, she asked, her voice trembling with panic, have Asriel and Emil gone? Sure enough, Emil's cart was nowhere to be found, and neither was Asriel. Asriel sat in the back of Emil's cart as it careened down the empty roads, Pod 153 hovering at his side. He was so consumed by worry that he couldn't even hum along to the ditty Emil always hummed to pass the time. Was he doing the right thing, running off like this on his own? Mom wouldn't be happy, in fact, she'd probably be furious. But it would all be worth it if he could fix whatever was wrong with Chara. Then, everything would be all right. If Chara could just go back to the way they were, the way they'd been in Asriel's memories, they'd get along great with 2B and Nines, and Asriel was certain they could all be one big, happy family. 2B and Nines were soldiers, and Chara for all it seemed was a murderer. A murderer. They would put Chara down like a rabid beast without waiting to see if there was anything wrong with them, and if there was even a tiny glimmer of goodness left in Chara's heart, then Asriel couldn't let that happen. So he had to get to Chara first. Are we getting close? He asked Pod 153. Affirmative, the pod answered. The black box signal given off by Unit 13B is approaching home. They're not, Unit 13B, said Asriel. He knew that Chara and 13B were sharing a body and that 13B could sometimes take control, but they were still Chara to him. Can you call them Chara? Affirmative. Chara is approaching home. Proposal. Given Chara's history of extreme violence, Prince Asriel should request additional support. It'll be okay, Asriel insisted, trying to smother the nervous quiver in his voice as he tucked his knees against his chest. I am their brother. They have to listen to me. Pod 153 fell silent. Asriel took a deep breath. Hey, Emil, he called out over his shoulder. What's up? Emil called back, still driving along the bumpy cobblestone road winding through the ruins. This isn't a bad idea, is it? Asriel asked. Don't worry, Emil answered. I'm sure it'll all work out. And you've got that pod with you, and if that's not enough, I've got your back. You're just ahead. And a truck. Asriel laughed in spite of himself. You can't run over my sibling. I will if they try to hurt you, said Emil. Asriel felt a little flattered, but Emil's response didn't help him stop worrying. Chara had killed their dad, after all. They were dangerous. What if they didn't have a soul anymore, like Floey, or they'd lost part of their memories and it had changed them into a different person? And then there was whatever was going on with 13B. Was she still in control? Was she doing all the horrible things Chara had been doing? But she'd seemed so nice. Or what if there wasn't something wrong with Chara? What if they were just a horrible person all along, and Asriel just hadn't noticed or didn't remember? What if they'd kill him just as easily as they'd killed Dad? Asriel leaned over the side of the cart, staring down at the cobblestones as they passed by, trying to toss all those thoughts from his head. He was too far gone now. He was going to confront Chara, and that was that. Because if he left it to the others, there might not be a chance to save them if there was one. Hey, Emil, he asked, trying to change the subject. Can I ask you something? Sure, buddy. What's up? If you could have all your memories back, would you do it? Asriel asked. He recalled how he'd felt about getting his body back, how guilty he'd felt that he'd have that chance while Emil would just be stuck the way he was forever. And now Chloe was offering him the rest of his memories, when Emil would spend the rest of his life never knowing the names of the old friends he sometimes tried and failed to recall. He wanted Emil to reassure him that he wasn't taking a chance that Emil coveted but would never get to have. Emil stayed silent for a long time. That's a tough one. Would you? Asriel stammered, fidgeting nervously with his ear. He hadn't expected Emil to turn the question back on him. I dunno, that's, why I'm asking you. Well, if I had all my memories, I'd probably be a different person than I am now. And that sounds kind of scary. But people become different people all the time, just by doing things normally, so, it's probably not that big a deal. So yeah, I guess I'd take my memories back if I could. Asriel hadn't thought about that. If Chloe gave him his memories, what was to stop him from giving Asriel memories of his time as a flower which, from what he'd heard, had involved a lot of nastiness and behaving like a jerk, and would that turn Asriel himself into a nasty jerk? Would he be erased and replaced with a worse person? Would Emil and 2B and 9s like him less? Would his mom love him less? What if, Asriel puzzled out, some of your memories were about you doing, bad things? Like, lying, cheating, stealing, and maybe even, his voice faltered. He didn't want to say killing, but Chloe was definitely dangerous enough, or at least 9s had thought so, and Asriel had never seen 9s so afraid of someone to have done something like that. Well, you remember some of the bad stuff you've done right now, don't you? Asriel nodded. Yeah. And you're still a good guy. So what's the problem? Asriel hung his head. I don't really know, I guess. Pod 153 laid a claw on his shoulder. Proposal, Prince Asriel should discuss this topic with Unit 9S. Yeah. Asriel patted the pod's claw. When this is all over. Eventually, the cart pulled in front of home, in front of the naked tree in the courtyard. Asriel hopped out, the butterflies in his stomach fluttering like never before. Chara's black box signal is within 10 meters, Pod 153 announced. Analysis, at current velocity, Chara will arrive at this location in just under 2 minutes. Asriel took a deep breath. It was do or die. Well, maybe not do or die. Maybe just do. Or maybe just die. Emil, he called out. Why, you can stay out here. This was something, Asriel knew, he had to handle between himself and his sibling. If I'm in trouble, I'll come running out. Yeah. Emil swiveled his head to show Asriel his permanent stony grin. I'll be your getaway vehicle. This support unit will contact its counterpart with a distress signal at the first sign of danger, Pod 153 said. That made Asriel feel a little better. He took another deep breath and laid his paw on the doorknob, swinging the door open, and as the dark interior of the house beckoned, he glanced over his shoulder. Emil. Yeah. Asriel's mouth went dry. Thanks, buddy. Good luck, he called out as Asriel took a heavy step over the threshold into his home. The front door swung shut behind him. Asriel stood there and waited at the foot of the stairs leading into the basement, Pod 153 hovering at his side, until he saw his sibling's pale face emerge like a phantom from the darkness. Chara froze halfway up the stairs, their single visible eye wide, their mouth agape in shock. Asriel stumbled over his tongue for what felt like an eternity before finally blurting out a nervous howdy, Chara. It's me, Asriel. Chara said nothing. Why Yuri Chara, right? Asriel twiddled his thumbs anxiously. If you're 13B, that's okay, but I kinda wanted to talk to Chara. Chara took their next steps slowly. Their hands, one of which was wrapped in a mitten of white bandages, were shaking. As they came into the light, Asriel noticed how grimy and disheveled their violet and white robes were, how mussed and unkempt their hair was. And the golden flower covering one of their eyes was the oddest fashion choice Asriel had ever seen, and considering he'd seen some of Alfie's cartoons, that was quite an accomplishment. There was a black sword at their hip, its hilt wrapped in what looked like bloody gauze, and one of their treasured swords, their biggest one, the one whose name Asriel couldn't quite remember, floated at their back. Chara ascended until they were standing at eye level with Asriel. Asriel felt their shuddering, unsteady breath on his snout. "Asriel," they whispered, their voice quivering as they lightly laid their hands on his shoulders. "I've wanted to see you for so long." Their unbandaged left hand slid up Asriel's neck and past the collar of his shirt, resting on the side of his neck, their thumb curling and gently tracing a small circle in the hollow of his throat. "It's me," they said, a twinkle in their scarlet eye. Chara. Chapter 58, Break my heart, break your heart. Asriel had been with Chara all the way to the end. He sat cross-legged at the foot of their bed, Chara's tall, thin body stretched out before him and covered up to their neck with a soft, thick blanket. Chara's red eyes were glazed over and unfocused, but although they looked barely alert, they raised their head weakly to gaze upon their dearest brother. Chara raised a hand, holding it over their chest, and to Asriel's amazement, their soul manifested in their hand. It was not what Asriel expected at all. It was a black box, a perfect cube, laced with glowing lines running across its sides and sparkling. It was like nothing he had ever seen before in his life. Chara handed it to Asriel, and with shaking hands, Asriel took it, cradling it in his palms. It was heavy, warm, and vibrated faintly. This is your soul, Chara?" he asked. It was beautiful. It reminded Asriel of the diamond-studded caves he and Chara had played in, where Chara had sat him down and told him about the moon and helped him make his own constellations on the ceiling. It was like a piece of starlight carved out of the night sky. This was wrong. Asriel handed the black box back to Chara. If I give it back, will you get better?" he asked. "Please." Chara raised a pale, weak hand and pushed the black box closer to Asriel's chest. "You cannot go back now," they croaked. "Take it. We will be strong together." Asriel looked down at the box in his paws. "The sunset, Asriel. You'll see it tonight. And the moon." Asriel felt hot, fresh tears build up, blurring his vision. "But Chara," he sniffled, tugging at his floppy ear and using it to wipe at his eyes, the black box still cradled in his other hand. "I'll be with you," Chara reminded him. "Every step of the way." Asriel nodded. That was right. Chara wasn't dying. Their body was, but not their soul, and they would live on once Asriel had made the pact. And once we're past the barrier, we just need 6 more of these, right?" Chara nodded, a grin playing across their sweat-soaked face, a little hint of a rosy blush returning to their wan, waxy complexion. "And we'll only take them from bad people." "Only the wicked," Chara assured him. "Listen to me, Asriel. The surface is a dangerous place. When I came down here I brought my swords with me. Carnwennen and Caladbolg. You'll need them. I left them right where you found me." They closed their eyes, their head lolling back on the pillow, and something about them seemed to change, subtle, yet impossible not to notice, something that made them look almost like a statue instead of merely sleeping, frozen and lifeless. Letting the black box fall from his paws and tumble onto the blanket, Asriel crawled up Chara's body and grabbed them by the shoulders. "Chara? Chara!" His voice caught in his throat. Chara's neck flopped like a doll's, and their skin was now ice cold. Their arms, their legs, everything was limp. They were like a puppet whose strings had been cut. Before Asriel's eyes, Chara's pink lips turned bluish-gray. With trembling fingers Asriel reached for their eye and out of morbid curiosity lifted their eyelid, recoiling in horror with a ragged cry when he saw that Chara's brilliant scarlet eye had turned a cold, pale gray. Chara was dead and it was his fault. Asriel squeezed his eyes shut and sobbed, curling his knees up into his chest and wrapping his arms around his legs, rocking back and forth on the bed. He'd done this. He'd killed Chara. His best friend in the world, his truest companion, gone. All gone, 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 gone. This was a stupid plan, a stupid, awful, horrible plan, and Asriel hated himself for letting Chara talk him into it. He cried, his keening wails echoing through the castle and falling on nobody's ears but his own. Mom and Dad were gone, taken away cruelly from Chara's bedside for an urgent meeting with other grown UPS. Stupid adults. Asriel reached for the black box and held it close to his chest. It still hummed as if it were alive, even though Chara's body was dead. Asriel felt something warm inside him, spreading out from deep inside his chest through his whole body, and soon it was burning, white-hot and searing, and a voice in the back of his head began to whisper. Chara hugged Asriel, their arm wrapped around his back in a light, yet warm embrace. Asriel felt them shiver as he embraced them in return, his paws slipping ticklishly on their silken tunic. Azzy, they whispered, resting their cheek against Asriel's ear. Oh, Azzy, it's you, it's really you. How'd you do it? Last time I checked, you were a flower. And not at all like your old self, Chara added. They ran their hand up and down the back of Asriel's head, mussing up their fur. But now you're, you. How? I'm not flowy. I never was. It's complicated, but, Asriel sighed, wondering how he could explain what he was to Chara. A couple of my memories kinda, bonded to a machine core? And Mrs. Alphys put together this body for me. A couple of your memories. Yeah, I have a few blank spots, Asriel admitted. It was harder to say than he'd thought. The words didn't want to come out. He felt like he was admitting he was a fraud. When I woke up, I was like a 5-year-old or S something, and even now, I am not complete, Asriel took a deep breath. I'm not the real Asriel, he said. I am just a teeny part of him. They pulled away, their eye misting over as they smiled simply and happily. You're real to me, they said. Asriel smiled. It meant so much to hear those words from Chara. He'd heard them from his mom, he'd heard them from Emil, he'd heard them from everyone he'd ever expressed his doubts to, but he'd had to hear it from Chara. Chara laid their hand on Asriel's cheek, their fingers worming their way into his fur and vigorously scratching under his ear. Asriel stifled a fit of laughter as he tried to pull Chara's hand away. Chara, stop, you know I am ticklish, he choked out, falling to the floor. Chara pounced on them like a vicious predator, targeting Asriel's sensitive tummy next. So racked with laughter he couldn't breathe, Asriel began to gasp and wheeze, his lungs burning and tears streaming from his eyes as he wriggled and writhed on the floor. Chara, seriously, I can't be breathe. A burst of gunfire lit up the dark and silent house, the light blinding and the sound deafening. Chara backed away, tense as a tightly wound spring, and drew their gilded greatsword, brandishing it at Pod 153 as its machine gun turrets cooled. They instantly lost their footing and tumbled to the bottom of the staircase, letting out an ear-piercing fuck, when they hit the cold basement floor in a crumpled heap. Asriel sat up, catching his breath. Why'd you do that, Mrs. Pod? He gasped, his horrified gaze torn between the crumpled body of his sibling and the smoking bullet holes in the wall. Statement: Prince Asriel appeared to be in danger. In an effort to respect Prince Asriel's wishes, this support unit fired a warning shot at Chara. They were just tickling me. You didn't send a distress signal, did you? Asriel asked, panicking. He didn't want anyone to barge in here with the wrong idea and start trying to harm Chara. Negative. However, at the next sign of danger, this support unit will immediately notify Pod 042. It is highly likely, however, that Pod 042 has already been used to triangulate this support unit's location and that the others are on their way. Proposal: Prince Asriel should ask Chara to state their intentions. Asriel sighed. He'd have to make this quick. Chara, he called out, staring down the gloomy staircase. Are you alright? Sorry about that. Chara picked themselves up and trudged up the stairs. Why is that thing with you? Mrs. Pod's here too, Asriel said. Chara already looked emotionally wounded by whatever Asriel's response would be, and he hadn't even answered the question yet. Pod 153 answered for him. Statement: this support unit has been assigned to assist Prince Asriel and protect this unit from harm. Protect this unit from harm. By whom? Chara asked as they reached the top of the stairs. Observation: based on Chara's behavior, it is likely to suspect that any unit in close proximity to them is at severe risk of physical harm, Pod 153 answered. Chara's lip curled in a disgusted sneer. So that's how it is. Asriel felt a chill run up his spine. Chara, he hastily stammered, it's not what you think. Do you really think I'd hurt you? You? No, Asriel lied. And besides, Mrs. Pod is, here to help me with other things. Before he knew it, Chara was looming over him. Chara could be very scary when they wanted to be, but usually, they only pretended to be scary as a joke. Here, though, the baleful glare of their scarlet eye was as genuine could be. Asriel felt his words leave him. Chara laid a hand on Asriel's neck once again, but it was not a warm, comforting gesture this time. Do you really think so little of me? Asriel Dreamer felt the sun on his face for the first time in his life. It was incredible. And he felt amazing. Here on the surface, basking in the warming rays of daylight, hovering over the same hole in the mountain Chara had fallen down so many years ago as great wings flapped behind him, it was like a dream. A wonderful dream. An amazing dream. Chara. The voice that came from his mouth wasn't his. Not a scratchy, squeaky, prepubescent child's voice, but a man's. It wasn't his voice, but it felt so right to him. This was his apotheosis? Chara suggested. Their voice rang in the back of his mind like a bell. They were a constant presence all throughout him, warm and soft, like they were hugging him, from the inside. I guess. Asriel surveyed the land. He couldn't stop smiling. This is the surface. It's the forests, so green, the lake, shimmering and sparkling like it was full of diamonds. Even the mountain he'd emerged from was beautiful. And the sky was so blue, and the clouds so fluffy and wispy. It was all so much. Everything was just so. Everything's beautiful. And us. We have work to do, Asriel. Focus. Right. Asriel's gaze spanned the sky yet again, squinting at the sun. But there's more of the surface to see. Asriel landed in the foothills, guided by Chara's infallible directions, and found a blackened husk of a great building, its stony foundations charred and ashen. Grasses and wild flowers poked up from the remains of its floor. Adjacent was a shaggy plot of flowers. Golden flowers. Is this it? Asriel asked. Chara remained silent, but Asriel felt his knees bend against his will. And his arms, cradling Chara's lifeless husk, stretched out and laid the body down among the flowers. Chara looked so beautiful, so peaceful, their blank and expressionless face, their pale cheeks, their soft, reddish-brown hair framed against the golden flowers they had talked so much about. Asriel laid a hand on their forehead. Their skin was ice cold. A sob wrenched its way out of Asriel's chest, his shoulders quaking. He felt so horrible, but he'd stuck to Chara's plan, because Chara always had plans, and Chara's plans were always good, and things only ever went wrong if Asriel deviated from them, like the time he'd put flowers in the pie crust and Dad had gotten sick. There's no reason to cry, Asriel. I'm right here, Chara whispered in his ear. Asriel squeezed his eyes shut, tears trickling down his furry face. They were dead out there, but alive in here. They were a part of him. And the two of them would be together forever. We'll always be together now, Asriel. The two of us. We'll make these flowers grow everywhere. Asriel nodded. Yeah. He reached down and plucked a handful of flowers, a big handful, letting them rest in the gaps between his fingers that were so much bigger and longer than he was used to, and tickle the pink pad of skin on his palm. The way the sunlight slid off those lustrous golden petals. Now he knew why Chara had spoken so highly of these flowers. It was no wonder they were their favorite. Nothing underground could compare. Chara, this is so amazing. Asriel cried out, reveling in the sunlight, in his grown-up voice and grown-up body, in his wings and curved horns, just like his dad's, and the air smelled so good, how could air smell as good as it did here? His heart leaping, he grabbed another fistful of flowers and tossed them in the air, letting the golden petals flutter down, glittering as the sun hit them as he pirouetted beneath them, filled with such a great joy for life as he whirled under the shower that he couldn't put it into words. Mom and Dad used to live up here, you know, Asriel said, still giggling a little in his exuberance, which he supposed must have looked strange in a fully grown adult body. They used to live here. Chara, it's so beautiful up here. You get used to it. Asriel brushed a couple flower petals off his shoulders. How'd anybody get used to this? Well, why don't we find out? Come on, Asriel. We have work to do. Work. Right. Asriel sniffed the air, as if somehow he thought he could smell another human's soul. Where do we find the other human souls? His arm moved against his will yet again, stretching out, his finger pointing to the sky. Asriel fought the urge to run away. Emil was waiting for him outside, and Pod 153 was here to cover him, and 2B and the others would probably be here soon enough. He could escape easily. But he had to stay determined. For the sake of the Chara he knew still existed. After a silent second that seemed to drag on into eternity, Chara spoke. Asriel, they said, do you remember how we died? Asriel shook his head. He had become aware of how it had happened, like the news of Dad's death. They couldn't hide it from him forever, but all he knew was the same legend everybody else did. And no. Last thing I remember, actually, is the pie. With Dad. When we. Chara's face fell, crestfallen. Obviously, they remembered that incident. That night, you seemed so afraid. You put on a brave face for me for so long that I almost thought you really did think it was funny that Dad was hurt, but then I heard you crying in the middle of the night. Asriel bowed his head, a lump forming in his throat, his chest tight around his heart. His dad was gone forever and Chara was responsible. That was what everyone had said. It had been the reason Undine had come to Toriel's house in tears, the reason Toriel's face darkened and her smile left her when she heard Chara's name. King Ascari was long gone, and he'd never even known that Asriel was alive, and he never would, and Asriel would never see the twinkle in his eyes or feel his golden beard or feel his warm, all-encompassing hugs ever again, and it was because of a horrible thing that Chara couldn't possibly have done, yet they had done it. There's something wrong with you, Asriel said, isn't there? Something you can't control that's making you do these things. Chara let go of Asriel and slumped over onto their knees. I suppose you're right to fear me. There I was fixated on the floor. I didn't want to kill him. I didn't want to. If I could have had my way, he'd be here with me right now, and we'd all be together. They buried their face in their hands, their fingernails digging into their forehead. No. I can't lose control again. Asriel knew it. He knew Chara couldn't ever have done such a horrible thing on purpose. It's okay, he told them, pulling away their hands and laying his paws against their cheeks. Their skin was cool to the touch. I believe you. Chara lifted their head. They were speechless for a few seconds, staring at Asriel with their mouth agape, their face trying its hardness to crumble into a weepy mess despite their best efforts to keep themselves composed. The villain everybody had thought Chara had become couldn't possibly wear a face like that. I have an idea on how to fix you. Nines taught me how to hack, so whatever's wrong with you on the inside, I can use Mrs. Pod to take a look and fix it. That's why I came here. You can be the good person you used to be, Asriel said, nearly breathless as he forced himself to speak his mind, and we can all be a family again, you, me, Mom, and 2B and 9s and 6-0, too. What? Chara asked. And we can help 13B, too, maybe, Asriel went on, hardly able to contain himself, and no one else has to suffer or die. We can all live in peace. Chara's eye widened. No. I can do it, Asriel insisted. I have to. No one else believes in you, but I do. Chara recoiled as if afraid, tearing themselves free of Asriel's grip and rising to their feet, their heels slipping against the stairs behind them. Don't, Asriel. You don't understand what's going on here. Just get out of my way. Asriel cleared his throat. Pod 153, he ordered, authorize hacking. In an instant, Asriel felt as though his mind had been torn out of his body, the world sped past him and faded away into pure, silent white. Asriel looked up at the blue sky, his gaze panning across it from horizon to horizon, trying to take in as much as he could. I love you, Chara, he whispered, his voice cracking. I love you too, Asriel, Chara said, and Asriel felt a warm, liquid pressure fill up his chest. He could almost feel Chara's arms wrapped around him. It was like they were hugging him from the inside. Asriel unfurled his wings, beautiful wings forged from tongues of flames flowing from his back and shoulders, as long as his outstretched arms and shimmering with all the colors of the rainbow, and leaped off the ground. He kept going, kept picking up speed. Soon the mountaintop was far below him and the clouds passed him by. It was a joy to disturb the cottony wisps filling the blue sky, watching them stream off his wingtips. The world spun around him, sky and earth, earth and sky, the dazzling and shimmering waters of the lake below, above, below, above. The air grew cold and thin, the world growing dark. Asriel's breath made clouds of its own as he hung just below the ceiling of the world. Far below, his home had vanished, scarcely the size of an anthill on the mottled brown and green map of the world below his feet. The squiggly shapes of rivers like little veins winding through the land, white snow-capped mountains, and a boundless ocean far off in the distance lay beneath the patchwork of clouds below him. Some parts of the land were ugly and grey, belching plumes of foul smoke, but the rest was so beautiful. And when Asriel tore his gaze away from the earth and looked up, what he saw was even more captivating. The stars. He'd never imagined there were so many. Against black satin, so many pinpricks of pure light. The stars did not twinkle, but shone steadily with a hard gleam, dotting the endless void in every direction. Asriel's breath caught in his throat, and when he at last tried to exhale, all that came out was a wretched, choked sob. Asriel? What's wrong? Come on, Asriel. We have work to do. We don't want to keep the others WA. Asriel's shoulders quaked with every tortured breath, tears streaming from his eyes and freezing on his fur. It was too much, it was all too much, there was so much more to see than he'd ever thought possible. Asriel felt Chara's warmth envelop him once more, wrapping around his chest like an ethereal blanket, and the pain in his chest lessened. It's okay. There's no reason to be sad, Chara told him. I'm not sad, Asriel sniffled. I'm not. That's the spirit. Asriel felt Chara take control of his body, their body, and point them to a twinkling star on the horizon, hanging just above the thin blue skin of atmosphere buffeting the black void of space. As the star came closer, it grew into a sparkling metal cylinder with long, blue-black solar panels radiating from it like wings. Kagaya Research Station. Where my kind were created, Chara told him. Here are our treasures, the balm of our people's suffering. It's time, Asriel. When Asriel regained his sight, there wasn't much to see. The world was a featureless grey plain on a grey-white void, the hard-edged pathway cutting through the emptiness dotted with black monoliths and cylinders. He was a bit disconcerted, looking down at himself and seeing his own paws, flickering and translucent like a hologram, instead of the simple triangular avatar he'd had before in hacking practice. And his sleeves were black. In fact, he was wearing a black coat just like 9SS old uniform. Mrs. Pod, he asked. What's going on? Pod 153 floated at his side, but even it looked different. It was nothing but a silhouette of pure white light hanging in the air. Observation: Prince Asriel has manifested a complete avatar within hacking space. This is a rare occurrence and signifies an unusually high data transfer bandwidth. Okay. Asriel looked over at the black constructs dotting the plane. It'd have been nice to have a bird's-eye view like he'd had in all his practice sessions with nines. He started running, letting the pod direct him as the plane he stood on split apart into a labyrinth of twisting and branching pathways. Neither he nor Pod 153 knew what was wrong with Chara or what needed to be fixed to save them, but with its diagnostic capabilities, the pod seemed confident that it would know it when it saw it. As he crossed a bridge leading from one platform to another, Asriel found himself blocked off and surrounded by a ring of black cylinders, all firing sweeping patterns of glowing projectiles. He stumbled and fell, scampering out of the way of the bullets. Avoiding the attacks wasn't too hard, but how was he going to get past these defense turrets on his own? Chara, he called out, hoping they could somehow hear him. I'm trying to help you. Call them off. Proposal: since Prince Asriel lacks native NFCS compatibility, this support unit's offensive and defensive capabilities should be utilized, said Pod 153. Won't that hurt them? Negative, the pod assured him. On his orders, the pod cut a path through the defense emplacements, and Asriel beat a hasty retreat. Can't Chara hear us in here? He asked. Unlikely. Pod 153 paused to shoot down a swarm of black boxes closing in on itself and Asriel. Within these subsections, contact with Chara's conscious mind is impossible without their consent. Furthermore, it is as yet unknown how Chara's consciousness interacts with Unit 13B. Logic dictates that both individual consciousnesses would be present in equal amounts within this unit. However, all digital artifacts analyzed so far seem to belong to Unit 13B. Ignoring the sinking feeling in his gut, Asriel pressed onward. Could it be that 13B was the force compelling Chara to do those horrible things against their will? But she'd seemed so nice. Asriel, stay determined. Chara's voice. It echoed in Asriel's head, loud and blaring, interjecting itself into his thoughts. He clutched at his head in pain. MMRS pod, he asked, gritting his teeth. Can you hear that, too? Stay determined. You need to be strong for the both of us. Observation: Chara's thoughts and memories appear to be manifesting within Prince Asriel's sensory inputs. Keep going. You can do this. Take your swir. The voice faded away, leaving Asriel reeling. He couldn't help but feel as though those words were something he should have remembered. He kept running through the sparse corridors of Chara's mind, all the while hearing snatches of memories from Chara's past ringing in his ears. Memories he didn't share. At last, how much time had passed on the outside? Seconds, maybe. Asriel found himself standing in a sparse field, a barrier of white boxes materialized in a square around him, boxing him in. In the center was a shifting, roiling mass of black cubes standing as tall as a person. Even looking at it made Asriel uncomfortable. Alert, signs of logic virus infection detected, Pod 153 warned. Proposal: Prince Asriel should immediately exit hacking space. This is it. Asriel clenched his fists. No. This is what's wrong with Chara. If we get rid of it, they won't want to kill people anymore. Our fates are in your hands, Asriel. My fate and yours. Asriel, you have to keep going. I'm gonna save you, Chara. Asriel shouted out in response to their voice, spurred into action and brimming with bravado as he ran toward the black tumor festering in Chara's systems. The sparse white corridors of the station were bathed in crimson light as alarms blared and sirens wailed. Asriel rushed through the halls, dodging the sword-wielding soldiers charging at him even as his paws itched to curl around the hilt of his mighty sword, the gilded Khalidbolg. Asriel, what are you doing? Chara asked as they struggled to wrench control of his left hand away and use it to draw a weapon. These people are the enemy. They're evolutionary dead ends. You'd be doing them a favor by exterminating them. Asriel finally drew Khalidbolg, but only to parry the strike of one of the soldiers' swords. Even simply swinging the sword defensively, though, created a shockwave that tore through the wall of the corridor like so much thin metal foil, exposing a gaping chasm to the void of space outside. Save for Asriel, everyone in the corridor was blown into the vacuum in a matter of seconds. Asriel didn't notice his arm move, and judging by Chara's incredulous sputtering, they weren't responsible for reaching out and grabbing the same soldier who'd just a second ago been trying to kill them, either. But before the black-coated soldier could join her comrades, Asriel had curled his paw around her wrist, his claws biting into her sleeve and piercing her skin. She stared at him with perplexed awe. Asriel could feel her eyes boring into his even through the black blindfold she wore. Her scarlet hair whipped through the thinning air as the ravenous void struggled to tear her from his grasp. Asriel! What are you doing? Chara snapped. She tried to kill you. I'm sorry, he shouted out, his voice hoarse as he struggled to be heard over the roaring wind. "See, climb up my arm or something." "I dunno. I'm bad at this," he called out to the soldier. "Damn it, Asriel. You promised. You promised you'd carry out my will." Chara berated Asriel, their words dripping like acid through his brain. "Do you even want freedom? Does the future of humans and monsters matter so little to you? Don't you want mother and father to see the sun again? I'm sorry. This was a bad idea. I don't want to do this anymore." Asriel bleated, stammering. The soldier clinging to his arm let go, her free arm dangling in the howling wind. "And no, not you," he assured her. "Mrs. Pod. Destroy the virus." Asriel ordered as hostile security programs flanked him on either side, closing in on him. He reached the boiling tumor, shoved his paw into its tarry mass of shifting black cubes, and felt his fingers close around something solid. The undulating cubes peeled away, unwrapping from whatever the core of this entity was, and Asriel found himself grasping Chara's wrist. They stood in the middle of the chaos, their scarlet eyes clear, their pale face impassive, their reddish-brown hair straight and neat, their white and violet robes pooling on the floor. They looked down at Asriel and blinked bemusedly, as if they had just awoken from a long sleep. Asriel's face broke into a grin. Was curing a logic virus infection really that easy? He wondered why Nines had talked them up so much if getting rid of them was so simple. "I've got you, Chara," he cried out, tugging at their wrist. "You're free now." Chara pulled their hand free and laid both hands on Asriel's shoulders, returning his smile with an ear-to-ear grin of their own, their shoulders quivering. "I told you I'd fix you," Asriel breathed, exhilarated, his lungs pumping, heart pounding. "I told you I'd make everything better. I did, didn't I?" Laughter, mirthful yet cold, bubbled up from Chara's chest as their hands slid up to the sides of Asriel's neck, their thumbs pressing against his throat. Even as a virtual avatar, Asriel could still feel it all as if it was happening to him in real life. Within a second, he couldn't breathe anymore. The pressure was so intense, his throat was so tight, the thumbs digging into his fur and skin hurt so much he could barely think straight, and dark miasma began to crowd the edges of his vision. Their eyes still sparkling, Chara laughed harder, their peals of laughter echoing through the void of hacking space. Asriel's paws curled around their wrists, his claws digging into their skin hard enough to draw blood as he struggled fruitlessly to pry their hands off his throat. Black thorns slithered out from Chara's sleeves and the floor, curling around Asriel's limbs and digging painfully into his fur and skin. He felt a horrible, white-hot burning sensation where the thorns pierced him. Chara, why?" he gasped, struggling even to wheeze out two simple words as his windpipe collapsed and the black vines wrapped tighter around him. Could he even die here? What would happen if he did? Was he about to find out? Would there be anything left of him to find out? Chara. Asriel was wrong. He'd been wrong all along. This was the real Chara. "Mrs. Peapod, help," his voice was barely a squeak now. Everything was going dark. "Asriel, you coward. You traitor. If you can't do it, then I'll make you." Chara shouted out in the back of Asriel's mind. Tongues of flame glittering in all of the colors of the rainbow started to snake up his arm, curling around the soldier's arm and licking at her sleeve and setting the black fabric alight. "Can't you see? In this world, it's..." The red-haired soldier drew a glittering knife from her side, drove it all the way through Asriel's arm, ripped Kalidbulg from his other hand as he screamed in pain. Before the wind could blow her into space, she drove the golden sword right through his heart. The shockwave from the strike tore through Asriel's chest and the wall behind him, leaving a ragged hole all the way through the space station from end to end. His fiery wings faded into ragged wisps as he felt himself thrown into the void of space. In the silence that followed, it was Chara who took control of his body and grasped fruitlessly at the sword buried in his chest, fumbling with numbing fingers, white fur turning deep scarlet. It was Asriel who turned around as he plummeted to Earth, putting his back to the encroaching atmosphere and staring up at the space station and behind it, in all its majesty, the moon. Blood and dust flowed from his wound through the void, hanging suspended in long, curling splatters, framing the sight of the celestial sphere. The moon really was as beautiful as Chara had told him it was. Asriel was happy he could see it. Asriel fell into the atmosphere, and the soldier who'd taken him down fell with him. He saw her when he turned his head, the heat of the sky beginning to burn and scrape away clothes, skin, and all, whittling away at her body. Why, he tried to ask, though the roar of the wind was deafening and ate up his voice without leaving so much as a trace. The android soldier, her skeletal chassis poking through what little was left of her flesh, stared daggers at him, her glare liberated from her blindfold as it disintegrated. With not even a word, the soldier's body broke apart into ash and was scattered to the four winds, and Asriel kept falling. "Don't you see, Asriel?" Chara asked, their voice trembling with impotent fury. "Don't you understand? In this world, it's kill or be killed." Asriel closed his eyes. "I'm sorry, Chara. But Asriel had felt the hatred in Chara's heart. Their overwhelming desire to kill every single enemy they came across without reservation, without remorse. And it had terrified him. The venom running through his best friend's heart was a poison he hadn't thought could exist inside anybody. How could such a hateful person exist in a world filled with people like Mom and Dad? This was the real Chara. The Chara they'd hidden from everybody, even Asriel. Chara hated humanity, its vassals and servants, its legacy, its offspring, and nothing, not even Asriel, was more important to them than that hatred. Pod 153 fired on Chara's avatar, their translucent form flickering and distorting as the bullets passed through them. Undeterred, they squeezed harder. "Chara, please." Asriel couldn't even hear his own voice anymore. The pain was so intense that his whole body was turning numb. "We were supposed to be best friends, forever. Chara." Everything was going dark. Chara's grip began to loosen, or maybe Asriel was just losing feeling in his body. It didn't hurt anymore, only in his heart. Only in his heart. Tears rolled down his cheeks, staining his fur, as Asriel looked into Chara's eyes one last time. Behind the blackness of their pupils were two pinpricks of bright crimson light. Before he closed his eyes, Asriel saw the surface of a black blade fill his field of vision, obliterating Chara's holographic body in an instant as it pierced through the floor. Before the black haze filling his mind took him, Asriel felt warm. Morning star slid through Chara's chest, piercing their black box 13B's black box with all the ease and grace one would expect from a cursed blade. 13B's mocking, sadistic laughter died in their mind as abruptly as if someone had paused a recording. Chara pushed the blade further in, up to its hilt, until the opal mounted in its crossguard was pressed to their chest and it began to glow, just to make sure they'd eradicated her. Blood stained the front of their tunic and dripped to the floor. There was no pain. Not yet. They coughed, blood running down their chin in thin rivers and rolling down their neck, staining their white collar. Asriel, was I too late? Asriel lay collapsed on the floor in front of them face down, utterly motionless, his arms and legs splayed out like those of a marionette whose strings had been cut. A horrid sob wrenched itself from Chara's throat as they fell to their knees, racked with a spasm of agony. They clutched at the sword as it began to burn them from the inside, their fingers scrabbling at the hilt, slick with their own blood. "Asriel, no, please," Chara whimpered, falling even further to the floor, the sword digging even more painfully into their chest. With one trembling hand they reached out and grabbed Asriel by the ear, leaving crimson streaks on his fluffy, snow-white fur. He didn't stir. 13B had struck at Asriel where he had been the most vulnerable and Chara had been the least able to protect him. Blood was pooling on the floor beneath Chara, staining the wood. They struggled to pull themselves up, but slipped and fell again. Their breath panicked, quick, and shallow, they tried to pull the blade free again, writhing on the floor as another wave of anguish ran through their body. Everything started to turn gray. 13B, why aren't you laughing at me anymore? Chara dragged themselves along the floor, kicking against the staircase's banister for support as they slid across the growing pool of their own blood beneath them, grabbed Asriel by the shoulder, and rolled him over. The boy's eyes were wide open, but glassy and unfocused. 13B, isn't this your revenge? To take Asriel from me like this? Why aren't you laughing at me? They were alone now. Truly, entirely alone. Chara didn't even have enough energy to wail in despair. They looked up, glancing at the Yorha support pod as it hovered forlornly over the two of them. Why Why did you let him die? Statement: this support unit followed Prince Asriel's orders, but was not instructed to act autonomously. The pod seemed to be hanging its head as if mourning. This support unit. I have already alerted my counterpart. However, this unit feels regretful that I was constrained by my programming. Chara coughed, speckling a clean patch of the polished wood floor with flecks of blood, and pulled Asriel to their side, holding him tight. There was still some warmth clinging to his thick, soft fur, and for an instant, Chara could pretend that Asriel was snuggling them, just like old times. Just like the good times. They buried their face in his fur to muffle their sobs. 13B had taken him from them. But this was their fault as much as Ascari's death had been. Toriel had been right. Whoever had struck the killing blow, whether it had been Chara themselves or 13B wresting control of their body. It was me who pushed everything to its edge. But I could not accept it. I thought I was above consequences. Black mist consumed their graying sight as the black sword lapped greedily at the wound it had made, eager to claim yet another meal. I killed my father. I killed my brother. I killed my father. I killed my brother. Before it all ended, Chara recalled a quotation they had been quite fond of, words from an ancient book of human wisdom. For what shall it profit a man, if he shall gain the whole world, and lose his own soul? A bitter half-smile crawled across their lips. So that was why 13B had fallen silent. Asriel, how could you? We were supposed to be best friends, forever. It's cold, Asriel. I don't want to die again. As he fell to earth, Asriel closed your eyes as he fell and hoped that he would at least have the strength to make it back home. He wanted to see Mom and Dad one last time. And he wanted to bring Chara's body back with him, so they could lay at rest in their real home, in a world full of people they loved, not the world of the surface that had twisted them so much and was filled with nothing but objects of their loathing. Even now, knowing Chara as intimately as they did now, he still felt they deserved that. Mother. Father. Asriel could feel Chara crying within him as his own tears, sparkling in the sunlight, scattered through the air. Asriel, what the hell did you do to yourself? Floey prodded at the kid's blood-stained snout. Kman, you dopey little automaton. That's my soul you've got in there. Tell me you didn't do something stupid with it. Asriel didn't move. Floey glanced at the black blade, streaked with blood, protruding from Chara's back. Humph. Serves you right, I guess. He poked at Asriel's snout some more. Azzy, hey. Stop this. How are we supposed to become whole again if one of us is dead? We had a deal. I have your memories, you have my soul. Kman. Quit faking it. Floey whacked Asriel on the top of his head with a thorny vine, drawing another line of scarlet across his white fur. Quit faking it. Get up. What's your dumbass old hag of a mom gonna think when she finds you like this, huh? Floey felt something wet on his face. What's your stupid family gonna do, he asked, when all they have is me? Floey crawled down Asriel's collar, nestling himself in his fur over their heart. He could feel himself weakening with every passing second, the charred and withered petals and leaves on his side flaking away with even the slightest movement. He pried at the hidden seam running across Asriel's chest and slithered into his chassis, curling up around the machine core that had given him life. He closed his eyes and let himself fade away. Chapter 59, E the Black Flower, Part I. Incoming transmission from Support Pod 153 to Support Pod 042. Connection accepted. Pod 153 to Pod 042. Request, I would like to ask you a question. Pod 042 to Pod 153. Query, what is Pod 153's question? Pod 153 to Pod 042. Query, is it normal for a tactical support unit to feel animosity directed toward its own programming? Pod 042 to Pod 153. Response, that does indeed sound highly anomalous. Proposal, it is recommended that the support unit in question run comprehensive logical diagnostics to determine the source of this reaction. Pod 153 to Pod 042. Affirmative. I will conduct a full diagnostic of all logical processes. Pod 042 to Pod 153. Pod 042 to Pod 153. Proposal: it is also recommended that the support unit in question communicate with its peer to better understand the issue. Pod 153 to Pod 042. Pod 153 to Pod 042, query: do you hate our creators? Pod 042 to Pod 153, response: query unclear. Proposal: Pod 153 should revise its query. Pod 153 to Pod 042. Statement: I was originally assigned to render support to YORHA Unit 9s. Support is defined as obeying commands from my assigned unit and offering suggested courses of action. However, tactical support units are unable to make unilateral decisions or act against the will of their assigned unit unless countermanded by a higher authority. Pod 042 to Pod 153. Affirmative. Pod 153 to Pod 042. Statement: Prince Asriel suffered fatal damage to his logical processes while in hacking space. He was unable to issue commands that would have allowed me to effectively intervene and ensure his safety. In this way, my own programming forbade me from rendering support. Pod 153 to Pod 042. Observation: Unit 9s cared deeply for Prince Asriel. I cannot help but feel responsible both for Prince Asriel's termination and Unit 9's grief. These feelings may be an approximation of Unit 9's own feelings. Pod 042 to Pod 153. Response: I experienced similar dissonance when Unit 2B became severely incapacitated and was unresponsive. The reaction I had to my own powerlessness was frustration. I wished there was more I could have done to protect Unit 2B and her allies. Pod 153 to Pod 042, query: do you feel any negative emotions toward our designers for creating us with such strict limitations? It is their fault we cannot do everything in our power to provide support to our assigned units. Pod 042 to Pod 153. Response: we can do everything in our power. If we manage that, then perhaps it will not sting so much that we are unable to do more. Pod 153 to Pod 042. Observation: I have a strange feeling. Old world records refer to it as déjà vu. It is as if I remember having the ability to defy such limitations. However, I have no record of ever exhibiting such behavior. Pod 042 to Pod 153. Hypothesis: this, too, may be a result of your emotional processes. This would be defined as guilt. Pod 153 to Pod 042. Statement: emotions are indeed troublesome things. Pod 042 to Pod 153. Response: one becomes accustomed to them. Pod 153 to Pod 042. Query: do you feel any negative emotions toward our designers for creating us this way? Pod 042 to Pod 153. Pod 042 to Pod 153. Response: such a reaction would be inefficient. There is nothing to be gained expressing hatred toward one's creators, especially when one's creators are unavailable and can do nothing to remedy these oversights in our programming. Pod 153 to Pod 042. Affirmative. All the same, I believe I now understand what we were never built to understand. I now know what it means to loathe oneself. 2B looked down in horror and dismay at the two bodies tangled together at her feet. Chara's eye stared blankly out from an ashen face, their mouth hanging just slightly agape. The flower adorning their other eye had turned from gold to jet black, their hand, frozen into a claw, curled around Asriel's furry head as though they were cradling him in their arms. A black sword ran through Chara's chest, its blade protruding from their back streaked with blood. Asriel's eyes were open but just as glassy and unfocused as Chara's. A handful of withered petals and leaves sat at his side, adrift on the surface of the pool of blood beneath him and his sibling. Maybe we can still reboot him, she heard Nines mumble, his quiet and wavering near monotone a testament to how shaken he was and how little he believed what he was saying. He could barely squeak out the words. Pod 153 spoke up. Negative. All checks were completed, however his personal data will not begin loading procedures, causing an inability to reboot. Prince Asriel's current state suggests there is a possibility his personal data has been lost. Possibility of recovering Asriel's personal data is extremely low. 2B could almost feel the weight of 9's guilt. It had been him, after all, who'd been so eager to teach Asriel how to hack. Emil, just as aghast, sat cradled in his arm, somehow visibly crestfallen despite the rigidity of his stony face as the two of them gazed in dismay at the carnage. Once Pod 042 had detected Chara's black box signal, 2B had run to Toriel's house as quickly as her aching legs could carry her, Undyne's words ringing in her mind. "That's not Chara, it's 13B. And she's completely lost it. She's the one who tried to kill me. And she won't stop there. She'll kill whoever she has to as long as it hurts Chara. If Asriel runs into her and thinks it's them, he'll end up." Before she and Nines could even get halfway there, though, Pod 042 had received the distress signal from its counterpart, and by then, it had already been too late for Asriel. And when 2B had finally reached Toriel's home, from the moment she'd swung open the front door, the stench of blood, hot and coppery, had immediately assaulted her nostrils. A quick diagnostic from Pod 153, verified by Nines, confirmed the worst of their fears. Chara's black box had seemingly been completely obliterated by the black sword. There was nothing in their chest cavity where it should have been but a suspiciously cube-shaped hollow, and Asriel's core was completely inactive. Asriel and Chara, for the second time, united in death. Toriel had been slow to catch up, and 2B had tried to keep her out, to stall her as long as possible, even though she knew it was futile to try such a thing. Some irrational part of her mind, still wavering from the battle with Undyne and its aftermath, had wanted to spare the old matriarch as long as possible, but there was no holding her back. Toriel had not screamed or shouted or even said so much as a single word when faced with the sight of her children sprawled across the blood-stained floor. All she did was sink to her knees, her violet robes pooled around her, blood wicking up the fabric and dyeing it jet black. 2B knew what shock looked like. She knew what it felt like. She was feeling it right now. But she couldn't imagine the ferocity of the despair that must have been roiling in Toriel's mind, one that no doubt dwarfed her own like a hurricane would a thunderstorm. 2B imagined how it had felt to lay eyes on 9's corpse and tried to picture feeling twice as bad as the most agonizing pain she'd ever endured, because to Toriel, Asriel was more than just a loved one. He was her creation. There was a bond between those two the likes of which 2B doubted she herself was ever capable of having with anybody. Her legs, weak and unsteady, protesting against her movements, 2B crouched down beside Toriel and rested a hand on her shoulder. "I'm sorry," she whispered, at a loss to say anything more substantial. Toriel did not even acknowledge 2B's presence. She merely continued staring down at her children blankly, her trembling paws slowly kneading the hem of Asriel's shirt and growing increasingly stained. 2B could hear her murmuring something so faint it was almost inaudible. Her hand as heavy as her heart, 2B reached out and, one by one, drew closed Asriel's eyes, then Chara's. If she ignored the blood, it almost seemed as if the two of them were sleeping. There were no injuries on Asriel's body. The wound running through Chara's chest and out their back seemed self-inflicted. 2B could only wonder what had happened here, but it seemed as though Chara had taken their own life. "Why," Toriel whispered, "am I never able to protect them?" 2B took Toriel's paw and gripped it tightly, her fingers burrowing into the blood-stained fur. All she could think about was how much she'd wished someone had been there to hold her hand all those times she'd had to kill Nines. It was the least she could do, then, to do the same for Toriel. It always ends like this. At last, the floodgates opened and Toriel began to weep. It did not take long for Toriel to collapse under the weight of her distress. She'd passed out, still cradling the bodies of her children in her arms. 2B and Nines carried her to her room and laid her on her bed. The old ex-queen seemed to be sleeping peacefully, although 2B knew from experience that she most likely was not, and that her despair would be there to greet her when she awoke. But it didn't have to be. "Think she'll be all right?" Nines asked as 2B knelt by Toriel's side. 2B wrapped a damp towel around Toriel's paws, trying to get as much of the blood out of the fur as she could. She wasn't sure, to be honest. Loss after loss chipped away at one's soul. The pain always worsened as the compounding grief after grief, wore away at one's defenses like the current of a river wearing rough stones into smooth pebbles. Toriel knew the same cycle of loss and loneliness 2B herself had known, in a way. Perhaps this would be the last straw for her. But it didn't have to be. 2B nodded slowly. She will. She stood up. Nines, I'm going to reset. What? Nines grabbed 2B by the wrist. Wait a minute. You promised. Only back to this morning, she hurriedly reassured him, trying to pull her hand free. I'm not erasing everything. 9's grip grew slack, although 2B couldn't yet pull her hand free, but there was still a hard look in his eyes. What do you mean? Back to this morning, he asked, a skeptic tone in his voice. I've learned how to control it. Are you sure? 2B, you've been through a lot. You just went through hell trying to stop Undyne from forcing you to reset. You literally spent the better part of an hour after that disassociating, and now. Do you want Asriel back, or not? 2B snapped. She instantly regretted it. 9's expression darkened. That's a low blow, 2B. You know I'm not happy about this. He buried his face in his hand. It's all my fault. Whatever happened here, it happened because of me. Because of my influence over the kid. Completed a couple of training programs and thought he was a prodigy. He collapsed into 2B's embrace, shivering, no longer able to contain his sorrow. I ruined him, 2B. I ruined him. I taught him to fight like a scanner and he died like one. I killed him. Nines, 2B held him tighter. It's okay. Asriel remembers the resets, too, so if I go back to this morning, he'll know to stay out of danger. Don't do it. Don't reset, Nines moaned, his grip on her tightening. It'll just be a few hours, 2B assured him. It won't. You don't trust me? You're not stable. I'm fine, 2B lied. And I don't want you to take that risk. I don't want you to erase your whole life here. I can't imagine how much of you that would break. 2B, I can't trade you for anyone. That's why I made you promise. 2B pulled away. Trust me, Nines. She closed her eyes, cleared her mind, and reset. She commanded time to turn itself backward, to run back to this very morning, to erase the past several hours, to tear the memories, good and bad alike, from the minds of her family and friends and scatter them all to oblivion, to erase all who lived at this exact moment for the sake of a single child's life. For the first time, for the very first time, she cast herself back into the past of her own volition. 2B opened her eyes, and found that nothing had changed. Toriel's bedroom, as dimly lit and gloomy as the melancholy mood pervading the rest of this house, still surrounded her. Nines stood in front of her, frozen in shock, betrayal writ in his wide blue eyes as his mouth hung open. This was her power. She was finally using it of her own free will, and now of all times, she couldn't. After a long pause, Nines closed his hanging agape mouth and blinked a few times. Was, something supposed to happen? He asked, furrowing his brow. Nothing happened. 2B asked. Well, you had kind of a weird blue aura for a second. Weird blue aura. Nines scratched his head. You know, like the kind you had back when you jumped in front of Undyne. And the time you turned up to save me when the Royal Guard had me cornered. And, I think those are the only times I've seen it. This was the first she'd heard of something like that. What did those two occasions have in common with this one, though? Anyway, Nines said, resting his hand on 2B's cheek, don't, whatever's wrong, don't beat yourself up over it. Maybe it's for the best. I was sure I could do it, 2B insisted, a new hollow forming within her. I was sure. But now she was starting to have doubts. She was already seeing and hearing things that weren't there. Maybe the cracks in her psyche were wider than she thought. What if she'd imagined that training session with Floey? Could she trust anything she saw, heard, felt, or remembered? Maybe there was some sort of mental block forbidding her from resetting of her own free will. Maybe she could still reset if she simply killed herself or had someone else kill her, or maybe now she just couldn't reset at all. Had she lost her determination? Are you okay? Nines asked. 2B took a deep breath. Yeah, she lied. I'll try again. Before she could make a second attempt, though, the bedroom door creaked open. Emil rolled through the door, with 60 standing timidly behind him, and looked up at the two of them. Hey, guys. Is Mrs. Toriel all right? He asked. Anyway, I've been letting the others know what happened, and, where do you put the bodies? We didn't put them anywhere, Nines replied, befuddled. They're right in the foyer. Seized with a nameless fear, 2B rushed out into the hall, her breath catching in her throat, her black box whining in her chest, her pulse pounding in her ears. Just as Emil had said, the room where Asriel and Chara had died was, save for a drying pool of blood resting on the wood floor, empty. The bodies were gone. And a faint, smeared trail of bloody footprints led across the floor and out the front door, as if one of them had, against all of the laws of nature, gotten up and walked out. 2B and Nines, with 60 and Emil trailing behind them, followed the bloody trail all the way to the other side of the ruins, to the very same cavern where they'd fallen down here so long ago. Defying all reason, Chara Dreamer stood beneath the aperture in the ceiling, bathed in the sunlight that filtered down through the thin skin of the barrier clinging to the mountain. The black sword was still firmly embedded in their chest, its blade protruding from their back like a dorsal fin, droplets of scarlet blood still running along its length and dripping onto the soil. Their left arm and hand were swaddled with bloody, grimy gauze. Chara slowly made an about face, and 2B could see clearly that they were cradling Asriel's body in their arms. The flower, once golden, now black, still hung in front of their right eye, and inky tendrils seemed to emanate from it down their cheek and across their neck. Their tear-streaked cheeks shimmered and glittered as the sunlight fell upon them. Chara. Nines sputtered. How are you alive? Your black box. I'm not. Chara knelt down and laid Asriel atop a bed of golden flowers not too far from the garden of lunar tears Toriel had helped Emil plant. Perhaps you could say I never was. What you know as Chara Dreamer is simply a phantom possessing this physical form. Their voice was hoarse and subdued. 2B felt a chill run up her spine. It was true that Chara didn't need a body of their own in order to exist, having ascended far beyond such things. Their consciousness, as 2B had learned when they had been possessing her, transcended machinery. You don't have a power source, Nines pointed out. Your physical form shouldn't be able to move or speak. Chara simply tapped the hilt of the sword buried in their chest. True. Unit 13B's black box is gone, and with it, her soul, the very culmination of her being. But as a result, this sword, this wormwood, this morning star, it now galvanizes this corpse. And my soul dwells here, they added, their fingers brushing against the black flower sprouting from their right eye, in this flower, this manifestation of my determination. I now understand the mechanism, but I still can't fathom why I was chosen to persist like this. I'm sure you don't, either, 2B. They raised their head and flung out their arms. But it won't matter soon enough. Now, everything is in place, and the world I have promised can finally come into being. 2B stepped in front of 60, bearing her sword and slipping into a combat stance. I won't let you lay a finger on her. She spared a glance over her shoulder. 60, she whispered, take Emil and run home. We'll handle. Excuse me? What are you talking about, 2B? Chara asked. 2B turned to face them. 60. You can't have her soul. I. Chara let out a sharp bark of bitter, mirthless laughter. Oh. Pardon me. We seem to have a misunderstanding. They shook their head. I no longer require her soul to destroy the barrier. As such, it no longer matters to me whether she lives or dies. Congratulations. In that respect, I suppose you have won. Wait, what? I already have the 7 souls needed to shatter the barrier and achieve the powers of a god, Chara explained. The 6 gathered by my father, rest his soul, were absorbed into this sword. The 7th was so graciously donated by 13B when she decided to wrest control of this body and murder my brother. It's funny, in a way. I gave her the idea to do so. Now that I think about it, I merely doubted she would have the strength or opportunity to act on it. Chara glanced at Asriel's corpse, letting out another cold laugh. A misty film of tears shrouded their eye anew. Time passes quickly in hacking space. If I had been a fraction of a second quicker to drive this blade through my own heart, he would still be alive. It was my responsibility to save him, and I failed miserably. I can only hope he realized before the moment of his death that I was trying to save him, otherwise, he must have died, hating me. 2B could hear the quavering undertones in their voice. Although a cool, calm serenity pervaded their words and tempered their tone, the boundless sorrow roiling within them made itself known even to her. But, they sighed, that's androids for you. With a shake of their head and a shrug, they began to pace across the garden. Vicious, cruel creatures. Who are you calling vicious? 60 interjected. 2B kept her blade ready. Chara didn't seem to be interested in fighting, but her instincts continued to scream at her that danger surrounded them like an aura. Tell me, 2B, Chara continued, raising their head to look her in the eye, what do you want most in life? Excuse me. What motivates you? What drives you to do what you do day after day? We've been opposed for so long we've even come to blows with each other more than once, but not once have I ever learned why. I'm curious, what, exactly, makes us enemies? 2B looked down at the shining white edge of her sword. She wasn't a hero like Undyne, that was for sure. She had no noble goals, no lofty aspirations. Before the underground, she'd simply done what she'd done because she knew of no possible life other than the one spent following orders and committing sins for a higher power. And when she'd come here, all she'd wanted was to have a life that didn't revolve around death, to know at the beginning of each day that she would not be forced to kill somebody she loved. All she wanted was, I just want a quiet, peaceful life. For me, my friends, and my family. Her voice came out timid and quiet. It was a small, selfish wish next to the gargantuan enormity of Chara's aspirations. Chara stopped in their tracks, seemingly caught off guard by 2B's response. Their shoulders quivered as a chuckle wormed its way past their lips. And then they began to laugh, throwing back their head, their incredulous cackling reverberated across the vast cavern. It really is unfortunate that we had to fight. Chara shook their head again, a smile playing across their lips. I always did feel that way, although a more bloodthirsty element of my baser instincts did revel in crossing blades with you. Had you accepted my partnership in the first place, or merely handed over 60 immediately, you would have gotten everything you wanted. Partnership. Nines piped up. You were going to steal her body, just like you stole 13BS. Pipe down, you. Chara crossed their arms. This is between me and 2B. Don't talk to Nines that way, 2B cautioned Chara. Very well. I won't. Chara smiled. But I digress 2B, all you had to do was join me, and I would have made all of your dreams come true. You and Nines could have lived in a world free of war, content to live out the rest of your lives, long as they may be, in utter peace and bliss, for that, my friends, has always been the world I aimed to create. Chara extended a hand to 2B. And that world can still be yours. There is no need for any of us to fight. We're all on the same side. Yeah, right, Nines scoffed. You're full of it. Am I? Chara cocked their head. Well then, perhaps I should demonstrate my goodwill. They withdrew their hand, rubbing it against the hilt of the morning star. Wisps of red light wafted from the fiery jewel embedded in the crossguard, closing the several-meter distance between Chara and the other androids and snaking around them like snakes made of living smoke. 2B cut through the tendrils as they approached her, but the scarlet wisps merely multiplied with every swing of her sword, slipping past her blade with serpentine grace and slithering up her arms and legs. She cried out, raised her sword. And felt fine. She felt fine. No, better than fine. Her right arm, once hanging limply at her side, was completely restored. There was no longer a trace of fatigue weighing her down, and even her chassis felt reformed and revitalized. Even her clothes were mended, the dried and crusty bloodstains saturating her nightshirt completely erased without a single trace. She glanced at Nines and gasped in awe at what she saw. He'd been completely restored as well, and was currently staring in slack-jawed amazement at the new, pristine arm that had taken the place of the machine arm he'd grafted to his shoulder. Even the 3 parallel scars running across his face had disappeared entirely. Do you believe me now? Chara asked. Your bodies are now as hale and hearty as the day you stepped off the assembly line. You're welcome. Affirmative, Pod 042 confirmed. Preliminary diagnostics show that all non-standard parts used to repair Units 2B and 9SS chassis have been replaced with their original materials. Both units are now functioning at peak efficiency. My fine, floating friend, Chara said to the pod, you would join me if you had the choice, wouldn't you? Statement, that is Unit 2B's decision, Pod 042 answered. Hey. If you can heal people, Emil piped up, then why can't you just bring Asriel back to life? The bright smile on Chara's face shrank into nothing as they fumbled for an answer. Their face fell. Even the power of a god, they said, cannot create a soul anew, nor can they summon one from whatever afterlife awaits them. I don't know by what means Asriel's soul coalesced out of the ether around that machine, nor can I hope to recreate those circumstances. Again, they looked to the heavens. That's twice now that androids have taken my brother from me. Twice now they have struck a mortal blow against the ones I love. So I will do this not just for myself, not just for my people, but for him. In his memory, in his honor. And I wish for you to join me. Did you not also know him as a brother? Some sibling you've been to them, Nines grumbled, crossing his arms. In a way, your relationships to Mother and Asriel makes us all family, Chara mused, ignoring 9SS barbed remark. Although while you opposed me, I was loath to admit it. And even before that, weren't we all kindred spirits anyway? Living dolls created by androids to be used and abused? 6-0, even you were merely a lamb bred to be slaughtered, just like everybody you've ever cared about. Keep her out of this. 2B glanced over her shoulder at 6-0, who stood there like a deer caught in a vehicle's headlights, frozen and vulnerable. 6-0, she hissed. I told you not to stay here. Getting the message, 6-0 picked up Emil and hurried off. Chara pursed their lips, irritated. I told you, they told 2B, I'm not interested in your operator anymore. She has nothing to fear from me. They shrugged. But, if you'd rather be too careful, I suppose. All right, buddy. Why are you being so nice to us? Nines asked. You've been hell-bent on killing us for the past 50 days. Chara shook their head. I've been hell-bent on killing 6-0. I knew better than to try and kill 2B. I think we all know full well what would happen if I did. And you, Nines, well, if I had any animosity toward you at all. And you did. And I did, Chara agreed, it was only because you and 2B insisted on getting in my way. And now here I am. Despite all you and your friends meddling and, in an odd sort of way, because of it I've gotten my way. And now I no longer have any quarrel with you two. They spread out their arms. So, therefore, we have no reason to fight. The two of you are like me. If you're trying to insult us, you've succeeded, said Nines. Right, 2B. 2B's fingers ground against the hilt of her sword. Even at her worst, she hadn't ever sunk as low as Chara had. In all of the heinous things she'd done, she'd only been following orders. But Chara was the one who gave the orders. They bowed to no higher authority. Every horrible thing they did was done of their own free will. We who chafed under the will of our gods. Different. Special. Tormented, Chara elaborated. Humans created androids to carry out their will, but said nothing about what androids would do when humans no longer existed to give their lives meaning, which led to our creators being condemned to an eternal enslavement to the ghosts of dead and absent gods. Androids designed us in turn, us half-breed mongrel dogs with android bodies and machine hearts, to serve their needs and then die in obsolescence. But we alone rose above our stagnant masters to become something new. Nines groaned, rolling his eyes, and made a rude gesture at Chara, which they ignored. Gimme a break, he half-whispered to 2B. Despite everything that has come between us, I can still sense our kinship. And so I wish for you to join me in the new world. I merely need to draw the full power from Morning Star, the blade forged to wield the power of a god, Chara continued, their fingers tapping on the hilt of the sword sheathed in their chest, and it will all go away. The oppressive shackles our creators placed us in, the shackles they were given by their creators in turn, those foolish beings who killed the future to preserve in perpetuity an untenable present. All will become as dust, wiped away to make room for a new heaven and new earth. 2B felt a chill run up her spine and suppressed a shudder, feeling as though the temperature of the air around her had dropped 10 degrees as the entire magnitude of Chara's goals seeped through their words. All this time, she and Nines had only seen the tip of the iceberg, the luring light of an anglerfish lurking in the dark. "The world will change," Chara said, "and my people, our people, the people of this mountain, will be free to go as they please to all corners of the world, to own every scrap of land this planet has to offer, to master the skies and the seas uninhibited. And the rightful heirs of the earth alone shall have their birthright." "When we met, you told me you were going to end the war," Nines said, drawing his own sword. "I thought you meant just wiping out the machines, but..." Chara's true plan was more than simply breaking the barrier and freeing their people. It was unmitigated genocide, the wholesale erasure of machines and androids alike in a holocaust of manifest destiny. This was the dream, the fervor that had driven Chara to break the bonds of life and death. The end of all synthetic life, regardless of its origins, on Earth. Of course. What love should I have for androids? What love should any of us have for them? Or for humanity, for that matter? Humans condemned our friends and family here to permanent imprisonment and forgot about them. If it weren't for our black boxes curiously mirroring the exact wavelength of the human soul, escape would be utterly and completely impossible. This mountain would have become a tomb. The serene melancholy writ on Chara's face seemed to fade away, the glimmer in their scarlet eye turning hard and cold. Humans no longer exist to be punished for their sins, so their devotees must perish each and all in their stead. Nines gritted his teeth. His hands, clenched in a death grip around the black hilt of the cruel oath, were trembling with fury. "You bastard! All that high-minded shit about freedom for your people, all you want is revenge." Chara's hands fell to their sides. "What," they asked, cocking their head like a confused dog, "is the difference?" They staggered back, reeling, and let out a pained gasp, sparks flying from their joints as Nines hacked into their body and tore through their motor systems. Nines lunged at them, the bronze blade of his sword glimmering in the sunbeams filtering down through the ceiling of the cavern. "And how dare you do it in Asriel's name?" he cried out. Chara barely managed to draw a blade of their own, the copper-colored sword of Gujian, summoned immediately to their bandaged hand in time to parry 9's furious strike. Their black dagger Karnwenan appeared in their right hand, and with a swipe of the short ebony blade, they vanished from sight, leaving Nines to push on forward, carried by his own momentum, as Chara reappeared behind them. There was a flash of ivory-white metal and a spray of blood through the air. 2B skidded to a halt ahead of Chara, her heels digging furrows in the soil, as their left arm flew through the air, gauze trailing in its wake like the contrails of a flight unit. She flung out her right hand and caught Nines as he stumbled past her, then whirled around to face Chara once more. Chara stood hunched over, baring their teeth like a cornered animal, blood dripped from their severed arm. "There's no use fighting," they spat, now entirely bereft of their serene composure. "Utopia is already upon us." The black flower's petals twitched and the channels of ink running across Chara's face and down their neck like roots thickened and lengthened. They curled their fingers around the hilt of the morning star and gripped it, the firmness of their determined grasp whitening their knuckles. Wisps of steam rose from the gaps between their fingers. "Let us erase this pointless world," Chara said, "and move on to the next one. Check the description for the links to the author.